Good morning. Good morning. Welcome. If you could please take a seat, we're going to begin with the day's proceedings. We have a very long and involved and engaged day, and I'm glad you're here. My name is Michael Pagano. I'm the Dean of the College of Urban Planning and Public Affairs and also the Project Director of the UIC Urban Forum. Welcome. On behalf of UIC, the Board of Trustees, Co-Chairs Tony Preckwinkle, Chancellor Paula Allen Mears, and Susana Vasquez, I welcome you to the 3rd Annual UIC Urban Forum and the 20th Annual UIC hosted conference on the urban challenges of contemporary society. The theme of this year's Urban Conference is the return of neighborhoods as an urban strategy, which is designed to focus our analytic and policy lenses on the critical importance of healthy neighborhoods as foundations to just, sustainable, and livable cities and regions. The conversation today brings together people from various places, organizations, and institutions with a variety of ideas, activities, and programs. The order of the day is outlined in your program, which should be on your seat. After the 2 morning panels with two keynote addresses sandwiched between the two, a box lunch is available in the room behind me, so you'll exit the doors here and go to the room behind me. The afternoon sessions take place in the large rooms that are in front of me, in the front of the building. 2 panel sessions begin at 1 p.m. and 2 other panel sessions begin at 2:30. After the last panel ends at 3:45, refreshments and cookies, of course, will be served at the foyer in the front lobby for further conversation and networking. So that we can continue to offer a high-level conference next year at the same time, please fill out the evaluation forms that are in your program and deposit them in the box at the entrance to the forum, or give them to anyone who is working with us today. The UIC Urban Forum recognizes our partners in this undertaking. It includes the MacArthur Foundation, the Chicago Community Trust, Chicago Public Media and WBEZ, Walgreens, Abbott, the College of Urban Planning and Public Affairs, and the Institute for Policy and Civic Engagement. We thank them for their support and collaboration. Recognition of those who put in endless hours to ensure a seamless event. We should note Jenny Sweeney, Sybil Abrams, Bruce Medvedev, Megan Houston, Stephanie Trutchen, Christy Sebastian and the JT team, Bill Burton, Jennifer Woodard, Rona Heifetz and Darcy Evon, among many, many others. Thanks to everyone for their participation. It's now my privilege to introduce the co-chair of this year's Urban Forum, Susana Vasquez. Susana is the executive director of LISC Chicago, whose mission it is to, quote, connect neighborhoods to the resources they need to become stronger and healthier. What better positioned person to co-chair the event and to provide a broad overview of the challenges, opportunities, and importance of neighborhoods to the sustainability and growth of metropolitan regions. Susana will kick off the event with a welcome and introduction to the broad theme of the return of neighborhoods as an urban strategy. Susana.
Good morning. Good morning. Excellent. Again, on behalf of my co-chairs, President Tony Preckwinkle and Chancellor Paula Allen Mears, I would like to welcome you to the 2014 Urban Forum. I would like to thank Michael Pagano and the UIC Forum team for inviting me to serve as a co-chair and for organizing today's event. So I must admit, when Michael first asked me to be a chair for this year's forum, given the title, The Return of the Neighborhood as an Urban Strategy, I was a bit concerned. So I asked Michael, who thinks neighborhoods stopped being an urban strategy? And where do those people think it went? Having dedicated my professional life, some 20 years, to the vocation of neighborhood work, as a community organizer, working for community development organizations, and now as executive director of LISC Chicago, I just see the world through neighborhood-colored glasses. So every day, for me, is about neighborhood strategy. So I agreed to serve as a co-chair, though, to be honest, I still thought the conference title sounded a bit like a campy horror movie. But seriously, neighborhoods may be returning as an urban strategy because of the ubiquitous data visualizations of Chicago. From school closings, to shootings, to internet use, to unemployment. When Chicago looks like this on a heat map, you begin to appreciate that while these can be called urban issues, they require neighborhood strategy. Today's panel will hit upon many of these issues. As long as where you live informs so strongly how well you live, we have an urgent need to support effective neighborhood strategy and the practitioners who lead them. If scholars, policy leaders, the media, and private philanthropy in particular are embracing the return of the neighborhood as an urban strategy, this should be a good thing. And new leadership in public libraries, universities, and the business community are focusing even more on neighborhoods as part of their larger strategies, which for me is a very exciting opportunity as this brings new ideas and new resources to the table. As we embrace its return, let's remember, however, some of the fundamentals of the work. From my experience, neighborhood strategy is about that deep relationship between people and place. And the fundamentals of neighborhood strategy anchor around 6 key words: engage, plan, act, communicate, evaluate, and repeat. Let me explain. Engage. It all starts with building relationships in a neighborhood and between the neighborhood and the people and institutions, often outside of it, that can generate more power, more opportunity, and investment for a particular place. This can be called community organizing or something else, but it's where it starts. It does not start with big theories or big data. Those are valuable and will inform the plan, but not until you've taken the time to listen to the folks in the neighborhoods who are closest to the issues that the theories and data hope to help. Plan. It has been written, where there is no vision, the people perish. And so those committed to neighborhood strategy must support local planning that brings stakeholders together to develop a vision and strategies to bring that vision to life. Planning requires dedicated staff, professional technical assistance, and the right data to be effective in the process and final product. And neighborhood plans have to connect to and inform broader citywide plans. Act. The last thing a neighborhood needs is another plan sitting on a shelf. So it also should be written in the Bible of neighborhood strategy that where there is no action, the plan will perish too. But action requires civic infrastructure. By that I mean the networks of leaders, institutions, and resources to take the plan and make it come to life. To sign up the parent leaders, teach the digital skills, move the health policy agendas, build the housing, and yes, reopen the closed schools. This is where the critical role of scholars, funders, public officials, and the alignment of resources with plans is most needed. Communicate. As you will hear today from our young leaders at the Bradwell School of Excellence, the power of a story told, of changing the narrative, of documenting a success as well as a setback, these are underappreciated tools in the Neighborhood Strategist Toolkit. As long as the first Google search result for a neighborhood is about who got shot, we have much more work to do to use data and real stories to challenge perceptions, inform better decision-making, and support neighborhood change strategies. Evaluate. Not just after a program is done, but as a tool throughout. Using data, stories, using one word at the end of a meeting. To evaluate literally means to pull the value out of something. It is not something done only by a person with a PhD using random control trials. It is something we must all do to practice and improve our neighborhood strategies. And repeat. You don't do any of this one time and go home. It takes layers of engagement and planning for neighborhoods to build the civic infrastructure to get things done. LISC is planned with neighborhood partners on broad quality of life issues, on education agendas, on technology ideas, and health outreach. And again, because to use the very hip tech lingo, this is the premier example of human-centered design, to engage local residents to plan for and enact a plan about their community. But even with these fundamentals, effective neighborhood strategy must be part of a larger urban and often national strategy that engages policymakers and is mindful of larger market forces. We need to work harder to make those connections stronger and policies more effective for the benefit of neighborhoods, our city, and our country. Throughout today's forum, you will not only get to hear from some of the best minds working on neighborhood strategy, but you're going to be in a room with more than 800 other people who care enough about neighborhood strategy to spend a day learning more about it. So I encourage you to listen, ask questions, say hello to someone you don't know, and take what you learned today back to your neighborhood to enact positive change. Thank you. It is now my pleasure to introduce our first panel, Building Livable Neighborhoods, Creative Destruction or Cultural Expulsion. First, Brian Bannon, Commissioner, Chicago Public Libraries. Phil Blackwell, retired Senior Minister, First United Methodist Church at Chicago Temple. Robin Staines, Executive Director, Advance Illinois, Staines Family Foundation. Rob Wynn, Associate Vice President for Community-Based Practice, University of Illinois Health, Hospital and Health Science Systems. And the panel will be moderated today by Nyla Budu, WBEZ. Thank you.
Susanna. Thanks, Susanna. Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me? Yes, okay. Yes? No? Okay, great. So as Susanna said, our topic this morning as we open this forum is looking particularly at building livable neighborhoods. And we have some great folks here from 4 different institutions. And actually, we're going to ask Robin to put on 2 hats because she's going to do nonprofits as well as education. And I thought what we would start with, when we speak about livable neighborhoods, I think the notion of creative destruction and cultural expulsion really speaks to the conflict that can often happen within neighborhoods. And oftentimes we look at forces and people and change in neighborhoods, and as we all know, that doesn't necessarily always happen in a cooperative or wonderful way. So we're going to talk about both the positive and negatives of that and the role these institutions play. So I thought I would just start with all of you, just starting with your institution. Brian, if you want to start with the library, Phil, if you want to speak about churches, in particular your church or other religious organizations, Robin, nonprofits, Rob, healthcare. What role do you see your institution playing at the neighborhood level? Brian?
Yeah, so, Chicago Public Library is, for those who don't know, is one of the great, I would like to say, the greatest library system in the United States. We have libraries in every neighborhood in the city, and those libraries are open every day after school. They're open on weekends. They are literally one of the most important, I think, neighborhood institutions that we have, in part because they're serving everyone. So while we see certain high-resource neighborhoods where people are connected, Susanna talked about this, there's an ecosystem of culture. There are also neighborhoods in the city where that isn't the case. There's neighborhoods in the city where we don't have a grocery store, even a 7-Eleven, but we do have a public library. And those libraries are serving as a platform, we think, for education, for connectivity, for community building and strengthening, and for people to come together to learn and discover, and most importantly, libraries in Chicago, and I think libraries around the country, are more about connecting people to the emerging ideas of the day in order to build a stronger, more democratic, and hopefully competitive community than we are about a particular format. Often people think about libraries and they go directly to books, which are great and an important part of what we do, but our mission is actually greater than that, and that's why I think it's nice to be included in a conversation about the role of the neighborhood and how we can leverage libraries to make them stronger.
Phil?
Yeah, well, it's a privilege to speak on behalf of all religious institutions of every sort everywhere. And I think one of the roles that religious traditions are able to play in the city has to do with shaping the vocabulary of how you talk about these issues. I'm more prone to talk about community than I am neighborhood, for instance, so that might be partly being an English major of years gone by, because just by derivation, neighborhood is the near, nay, bore farmer. It's the person at the next field over. Proximity is important, but community, based on Latin for common task or vision, to me is a much more provocative and much richer potential for religious language, and part of the engagement that already has been mentioned. So I think one contribution that religious institutions and people dealing with the kinds of structures of thought has to do with how do we enrich the language, and particularly the public discourse, allowing those words to come in. Political language and economic language, corporate language, are really potentially and actually deadening to this kind of conversation. So how do we talk about compassion, the common good, enhancing human life? Those are not limited to religious categories, but those are the kinds of things religious communities are inclined to talk about. So how does that get into the public discourse?
Robin?
So the Staines Family Foundation does place-based giving. We concentrate our giving on a neighborhood on the west side of Chicago. And one of the things that makes that attractive is that the goal of most nonprofits and foundations is to find ways to support individuals and families to go on to live healthy, productive lives. And if you want to do that, you have to care about education, you have to care about safety, you have to care about health, you have to care about employment, you have to care about so many of the factors that are going to bear on individuals and families. And so being able to work, what nonprofits and foundations are frequently interested in doing is how do I make sure that there's the infrastructure that surrounds individuals and families. And neighborhood's a very logical way to try and actually touch families in multiple, not just in one dimension or another. And schools, same way. If you care about that, schools are one of the anchor institutions in any neighborhood where you're going to meet virtually all children, virtually all families. And again, if what you want to do is equip kids with an education that allows them to go out and expand their opportunities and their options, the single most proven way to do that, you have to care about safety, you have to care about health, you have to care about housing, you have to care about what's happening in the family and employment, et cetera. And so being able to wrap services and supports around a neighborhood and fill in gaps in a more comprehensive way, I think is why, a neighborhood-based, the role of nonprofits interacting in neighborhoods becomes really powerful and attractive.
Rob?
Yeah, I've been thinking about this a lot, and particularly with all the transition and all the uproar about health. Turns out that I think the president really, of the United States, really sort of set the tone, where he sort of said health is really critical. He made that an issue. We know that there are things that have gotten in the way of that. However, it remains something that is critical for, I think, all of our academic health institutions and all of our health institutions. As I was trained, it turned out that an academic health institution has a tripartite mission. And I learned that tripartite mission of, taking care of patients, research, and education, teaching the next generation. But I actually have come to realize that our communities actually have a tripartite mission. That is the ability to have health, the ability to be well educated, and the ability to sort of acquire at least wealth that's able to sort of take care of those communities. So it's been an interesting struggle for me about how does an academic institution align their tripartite mission with those of the community. And then it dawned on me. The reality is that while health isn't the only thing, we've been focused so much on health that we forgot about wellness. And we forgot about this context of what a health institution could do to be totally integrated, hearing the voices within the communities that would then say, here are the physicians that we need, and here are the nurses or the practitioners that we would need. So my whole vision of where I started off in medical school has now transitioned from gaining knowledge, building technologies, and having the mantra of being a scientist as well. So I'm a physician scientist, having this concept of bench the bedside. We say that all through the country, bench the bedside. But there's one important thing. What if they're not in the bed? It stops short of really what we're talking about in this context of wellness. Shouldn't an institution that's about health not only stop at the bench to bedside, but what about bench to the community? What about new technologies that are efficient that we can get in the hands of our primary care docs? This is a new discussion that's actually happening, I think, within the confines of academic centers and communities. How do we deliver better care and more health? Because imagine, for example, an area like the south or the west side of Chicago, like in Englewood, without any healthcare facilities. That becomes a very, actually scary sort of thought that all of our community health centers are at risk. And imagine if they go away, and what the cost of not having health and access to health actually has an impact on the education and on those communities clearly. So the big issue, I think it's an exciting time for, I won't say medicine because I used to say that a decade ago, but I'm going to say our health institutions really be about health care as opposed to just about the delivery of drugs and medicine. So.
Well, and all of you have brought up issues that I want to delve into deeper with gaps with education, of course, certainly everything in terms of how we look at health institutions, our religious institutions. Ryan, let me start back with you with the role of the library, and particularly, obviously, the Chicago Public Library. What do you see as, you mentioned that you have, obviously, you have an enormous system throughout the city, very different neighborhoods. How do you balance that? What are the challenges of providing library systems and providing adequate services making sure that every neighborhood has what they need. Does that, for you all, does that come from the neighborhood? Does that come from that library? How do you all manage that?
It's a great question, and I think the short answer is some of it comes from the neighborhood, some of it comes from the people working in the libraries. Many of the people who work in our libraries actually live within the communities that we're serving, so it's a really important piece. And then it also comes from studying and understanding data and how people are using and the demand. And it also comes from setting we call it a program, the core services that every library should have. And starting with the core services, I mean, if you walk into any Chicago Public Library, what you'd find is we actually have the largest free homework help program in the city. All 80 locations provide free after-school homework help to kids and families regardless of what neighborhood, and that's supported through private philanthropy and the Library Foundation. We're also the largest provider of free and open access to computers in the city, and the map that Susanna showed earlier, that's a really important point, that while we look to close the digital divide, we still have communities in Chicago that have 30% of households that have access to the internet. There's still 19% of Chicagoans who have zero access from any point of view, and the library is that place. We're the largest provider in every community. And so those types of things, technology, homework assistance, books, materials, a trained librarian that can support you in your research needs, those we see as examples of kind of the core services we provide.
And when you're talking about particular neighborhoods, I'm thinking about initiatives that you do, like the Wi-Fi hotspot. Like, can you explain a little bit about that and how you sort of see that bridging, particularly the digital divide in neighborhoods where that's really an issue?
So we are about to launch a pilot project to begin pushing on that question of how we change broadband adoption and improve digital skills. One solution, we think, might be to lend out hotspots and provide digital skill wraparound services. That's actually based on looking at technology demand in our neighborhood library, so we actually have good data on what the usage is. And it's also based on broadband adoption rates, which we have, Susanna actually showed the map earlier. Those points, as well as working with community-based organizations, are influencing where we select those locations. We do something very similar when we're looking at Citizen or New American services. While every library has a core set of materials to support the process for the citizenship exam, connecting people to services, we have 20 locations that go even deeper, and soon we'll be announcing, and I can't tell you the details of it, an even deeper commitment to citizenship and citizen services in those neighborhoods that the demographic and the demand at those locations is telling us that we need to have a higher touch. So it's a combination.
No details?
No, the mayor's going to announce it, not me. On Friday.
All right, we're going to stay tuned for that. Okay. Before we get to specific neighborhoods, because I do want to follow up and ask you about specific neighborhoods and how this is working, Phil, I wanted to bring up something you said, and I think we can use First United Methodist at the Chicago Temple as an example. You said you feel the role that religious institutions can play as a really important role in shaping language, but I think a lot of that language also has to do with the language that we use has to do with perceptions that we have. And maybe you can explain a little bit using your congregation as an example of the role that First United Methodist has played in downtown, the value that it's brought in terms of, maybe I think there might be things that people don't think of when they're thinking about the role that a religious institution plays, that maybe things, just like Brian was saying, the library does things apart from just books, sort of the traditional interpretation. I'm curious if you can use the Chicago Temple as an example of that.
Yeah. Well, religious language is best wordless and action-oriented, so that sometimes our language is not what we say, but what we do. The First United Methodist Church at the Chicago Temple is the oldest congregation in the city, founded in the 1830s. You can put yourself on Daley Plaza and look to the southwest corner. There's this skyscraper with a steeple on top. It looks like a bank down below because there's a Harris Bank down below. People said, how did that happen? We said, well, we threw the money changers out, but not far enough, and they got the best corner. So we had to work on that. But it's a multi-use building, including 15 floors of lawyers. And it was Clarence Darrow's office back in the 1920s and 30s. So it's a very peculiar building, but it's a very interesting corner because of its public domain. There's a group from the University of Pennsylvania, Department of Policy and Practice or some such, that has done a study of all sorts of congregations in Chicago, of which the Temple was one. to try and figure out what is the sidewalk value of having a church or a synagogue or a mosque in a particular neighborhood. So they took a look at what this congregation does at Clark and Washington, and they looked at the homeless program and figured out how many volunteer hours involved, and the free food that's been donated by Trader Joe's, and the clothes donated, and the legal advice given by DePaul Law School and all. And they calculated that that was worth, in a year, probably about $400,000 to the city, even though the church paid $40,000 to make it happen, and the city paid nothing. So then they worked through other ministries of the church, the tutoring program we had with Ruben Salazar School, and the hosting of the Silk Road Rising Multicultural Theater, and the 1812 step groups that we have each week. What's the value put on somebody in Alcoholics Anonymous not reverting to alcoholism? That's a tough one to put a dollar on. But they went through all of what the church was doing and determined that the sidewalk value of that congregation to the city is about $8 million a year for the congregation's $1 million of operating budget. So it's an 8-to-1 value. Now that's a rather large number, but if you go to Fourth Presbyterian or Old St. Pat's or other places, you'll come up with about that same thing. But if you go to any religious entity, including a storefront church in some neighborhood, if it has an after-school program or a lunch program or a healthcare drop-in center, that's going to be added value to that neighborhood. So one of the things that this project has shown is that independent of what is the parochial and religious intent of the religious entity, I mean, they put no dollar value on my sermons, for instance, and still came up with $8 million, that religious institutions can, but not necessarily will or do, but they can play a role of adding value to a neighborhood that's available to everybody.
Obviously, another institution that adds value to neighborhoods, and as I'm thinking about what Brian said about neighborhoods where maybe there isn't a grocery store, but there's a library, there's also often a school. And Robin, I wonder if you can sort of put on your Advance Illinois hat and discuss a little bit more about the role of public education, and as we look at livable neighborhoods, what the challenges are, particularly with neighborhood schools.
So we have a couple of very enormous ones, and I want to pick up on something Susan said during the beginning, which is that to think about neighborhoods in isolation to the broader policies that are impacting them, I think becomes particularly true, that you've got challenges and opportunities that interplay as they intersect in schools. So one is we'll use North Lawndale as an example. North Lawndale has historically been, you want the schools to function unbelievably robustly, and that's got two dimensions. One, you want to make sure there are fabulous principals and teachers that are there for students every day. And North Lawndale has historically been a hard-to-staff school. That means it's more likely to have vacancies, it's more likely to hire later. The foundation actually, for a number of years, worked with a network of schools there, and we would bring in new teachers early and sort of introduce them to the neighborhood, have them literally walk the neighborhoods and meet parents, et cetera, because what we were finding is that one of the biggest reasons it was difficult to attract teachers to the neighborhood is that they were being counseled away from it by their parents. Well, you don't want to work there. That is not safe. I don't think that it's going to be okay if you go in that school. And so, many teachers when they're starting are young and they're swayed by that sort of thing. And so there's an interplay there, right, between the neighborhood and the broader world and perceptions that you can't entirely control. And the second is that if you know that kids who are coming into the school buildings in North Lawndale, so the first challenge is you need the dollars, the resources, and the human capital. The second is there's a whole bunch of other supports and issues that the school needs to be equipped to deal with, whether they want to be or they're going to have to be. And the reality is that's kind of an underground economy right now. We need schools to provide counseling services. We need them to work on mental health. We need them to be able to have either healthcare facilities within their buildings or that they're figuring out how to make sure that kids and families know how to access this. They know that they're going to be dealing with kids who have safety issues getting to and from, et cetera. But we don't resource schools to do that. We don't train teachers and principals in those skill sets. We don't really talk about it in the sense that we have no way of measuring, like if the school that's a big part of what they do, it's not frequently what anybody looks at to see is this a good school? Is it a high quality school? It tends to be about the test scores way more than it is about what's happening in terms of the environment, the social emotional learning, and the support services. So that there are macro forces at play there. It can be, so there's huge opportunities for schools to be hubs and to bring in I'm going to talk later in one of your other questions. Like one of the great responses to that, I think, is when you really bring a community together around a school to figure out how do we start to meet the needs, even if the system that's in place isn't set up to do that the way it needs to be set up to do that. But it's a huge challenge.
Well, it's a huge challenge, and I want to talk about the macro forces, but before we get to that macro forces, all of you have sort of brought up or kind of hinted at your organization playing a non-traditional role because it's filling a gap. And I wonder if each of you could speak to that, just sort of the role that you find your organization, Robin, whether it's a nonprofit or schools, whether it's health institutions or libraries, what gaps are you all feeling like you are either having to fill in or do something that may be apart from what your traditional mission has been? And anyone can jump in here.
It's often the case in a number of neighborhoods that the religious body there was there before the neighborhood changed, and it has to change with the neighborhood as it goes along. So sometimes the religious institutions, at their best, can provide a stabilizing tethering point when other things change. I think of Old St. Pat's Roman Catholic Church up the road here that used to have a neighborhood, and then it got plowed under for the Kennedy Expressway. And they've reinvented themselves by creating a community, not a neighborhood, but a community of people based on the strength of their, not only their belief systems, but also their public service. So they've been able to anchor a section of the city when the whole city around it has changed. So sometimes the religious institutions, often related to the in-migration historically, if the institution can change, it will be a tethering point while everything else is in flux.
I would add that I think one of the roles that a foundation can play, and that I think we've whether we fully understood that how important it would be or not, is connective tissue. Because even though the neighborhood of North Lawndale, for an example, but this would be true, Englewood, Austin, wherever you want to point, is relatively small, the degree to which people are working in isolation is profound. And so you'd even bring together principals from across schools, and they hadn't sat down and talked with each other. And yet the amount that they can learn and share on the opportunities for partnership or just stealing good ideas is enormous. Then when you start to bring them together with people who are in the health systems or the libraries, et cetera, I don't have to have all of the materials for my kids to do a mock constitutional convention. The library could have that, and they could actually shuttle that school to school. Those conversations aren't necessarily happening organically because people are so busy, they're so heads down, and things aren't really set up to do that. And so just the connective tissue to create a community, if you will, of people who are really trying to provide a comprehensive set of supports for kids and families.
And I think from a health perspective, it's an exciting time for us. It's a little bit like Copernicus in one way, where he lived in a time where people believed truly that the sun evolved around the earth. In a very similar manner, I think healthcare has actually had that same issue. It turns out that we, for decades, have essentially assumed that people in these communities and patients evolved around us. The interesting thing that is actually happening is this awakening of, wait a minute, why would it take someone from Englewood, 3 buses and a train to sort of get health care, where we probably ought to be there? So when you talk about the gaps that are being filled, I think right now there is an awakening of us having to be back and reconnected to those communities to make the most complete care as possible and get it as close as possible to our communities, because we know that the closer it is, the more accessible it is. That's a fact. The other thing about a gap that's actually kind of interesting and intriguing for me, and it's been exciting for me, is a recognition that many healthcare providers recognize it's not just about giving medicines anymore, it's about providing and being an advocate for example, health deserts or food deserts. So typically what happens is in the same area there are issues with health, there are issues usually with access to exercise, which is part of health and wellness, and access to good food. And so I think there really is this new awakening of filling in the gaps, and that we have to be more than just putting in a clinic and putting up our 4 walls with our stethoscopes and having people come in, that we have to be much more than that. And to be involved in that, you really have to be connected to the community, to the access to the library, to the religious issues that are happening within that community. And so it's an exciting time for healthcare providers such as myself, because it's no longer the 4 big brick walls with the ivy covered and people come to us, it's really a concept of now filling in those gaps of how do we go there, and it's exciting.
So for the library, it's a great question for the library, because I think when we think about the roles that we were playing, the non-traditional roles, I almost would flip it and think in terms of there are many things that we see happening in the library that are more symptoms of what are needed in a community. And libraries, because of our mission, we either provide a service or build a service to support that individual. We partner with someone in the community to help provide that service that's needed, or we have a referral. So for example, there are libraries where we'll see bathing and sleeping and a variety of needs that represent folks might need access to a shelter or services to support homelessness. We actually have great relationships with the organizations in the city that help do that referral, and in fact, in some of our community libraries where that's a bigger challenge, we actually partner with institutions that bring in social workers to help make that connection more deliberate. One of the things we talked about a lot in libraries is that we serve so many kids after school, and in some of those neighborhoods, the kids are hungry, right? The last time they had lunch was at school, and sometimes that lunch was at 10:30 or 11 o'clock, and they're with us till 6 or 8 o'clock at night. That's why this summer we worked with the Greater Food Depository to do snack and food delivery at select locations around the city that helped us sort of address that need at the library. And so I think one of the things that's so great about the library is that we sort of have in our toolkit either the things that we can provide, like this is a service we can provide, technology related, we can actually absorb that service, we can partner, or we can refer. And that's actually part of our mission, which is kind of cool.
What is the library's mission?
Well, we say to read, learn, discover at the Chicago Public Library. But really, when I think about a library, it's about connecting people to the leading ideas of the day in order to make a stronger, more democratic, and hopefully competitive society. And in some cases, in order to do that, it means filling their bellies before they can learn. In some cases, it means giving folks access to the basic digital skills so they can find a job. And so we do have this pretty, I think, transformational mission. And what's cool about libraries, in my view, is that mission hasn't changed. When Franklin was talking about libraries as part of the framing of the American library model a long time ago, he was using the library as a place to demonstrate science experiments with electricity, as well as a place to share knowledge through books. And that's really how we're doing libraries today.
Most churches have kitchens. Some of them function. And so you bring the food, and you bring the healthcare, and you bring the expert in, and let's have cooking classes downstairs in the church kitchen so that people in the neighborhoods learn how to cook the food that is most useful to them. There's no reason why we can't all show up at the same place with what we've got, and putting it together would be of more use than operating separately.
But
In that case, we provide the cookbooks, and the Greater Food Depository, Food Depository would give you the food.
But Phil, how often does that happen? Because that's really what creates a livable neighborhood. But how often does that happen, and what prevents that from happening? Is it the connective tissue that you talked about, Robin? Like, what do you think it is that prevents organizations such as yourself from being able to work together at the neighborhood level?
I don't know that I've got a single great answer. I think there are a whole series of things that happen, and some communities are very transient, so you've got that working against you. Some neighborhoods are not transient, but you've got safety issues, and so the degree to which people are going to travel at different times of the day are different in an Englewood than they might be in a Lincoln Park, and so the ability to sort of offer those things comes with more complications. Then even when you bring leaders together who weren't historically talking, which has been something that I think has happened more and more in North Wanda, for example, that requires constant care and attention because you've always got leadership change. And with the leadership change, is there somebody else who's sort of making it easy and facilitating and sort of inviting and pushing on that? Because again, these can be very overwhelming sets of institutions to run and circumstances, both at the individual family household level, right? So, what are the demands on that parent in that household and their ability to sort of leave and show up for something as simple and a good idea as a cooking class, as well as institutions who are fighting for every last dollar, who just got cut, who are having to, in these days where we've basically been borrowing on the backs of nonprofits, all energy that should be spent on delivering services has been spent on, where the hell am I going to get another loan? And I don't know if the payments are going to come 6 months late or 8 months late. And if you're a school, nobody's going to do business with me anymore because you don't want to be a contractor who's going to get paid by the state of Illinois anymore. And the contractors who are, the quality is lower and lower and lower. I mean, and these are things that never sort of make the public air and that we don't really talk about, but that from the life of somebody who's trying to run an institution, let alone have the ability to really do the conversations, the constant conversations, it can become just exhausting and overwhelming.
Well, and I think that's a really great point to something that we've all had conversations about as we were preparing for this panel. It's something that you've been alluding to, kind of these macro forces, right? We're talking about neighborhoods, but the reality is oftentimes there are these external forces that create policies that then neighborhoods and the institutions that work in them are forced to deal with. And I think actually, perhaps one of the best examples of this is ACA. And maybe we can start with ACA and that role on the role that ACA has played with, certainly I imagine you would say it's both an exciting and challenging time as you were adapting to this, but how that has played a role in specific community health and also the notion of providing health care at the neighborhood level.
No, I mean, it has been both a vexing and exciting time in the context of the Affordable Health Care Act. The number one issue around the Affordable Health Care Act is trying to understand it. It has been, even with experts, we are struggling with the concept of what does it do, what could it do, and is it all going to work? To be quite honest with you, and I don't think I'm just putting on rose-colored glasses, I think I'm the first to tell you that I think that it brings tremendous opportunities and a lot of hope, and I do see the light at the end of the tunnel. The ability to be able to provide more insurance for more folks that live in this country is a good thing. The ability to now put the emphasis off of the quaternary care back onto the primary care drives this concept of the need for us to be back in the community. Now, the issue becomes that most of the patients that are getting the Affordable Health Care Act benefits are not some of the traditional patients that people have always wanted to see.
By that you mean?
But in the context of underserved populations that now have an insurance that might not look exactly like the premium insurance, but they have some. And so this concept of what does some insurance look like, and should we focus on those people who get some insurance or the people who we've traditionally had with the gold, if you will, the gold platter insurance? That's going to be a struggle for everyone. The nice thing about it is that I will tell you that in this city, many of us are, instead of running from that concept, or instead of sitting on the sidelines, have embraced it and sort of said, this is what we do. And particularly at UI Health, it's our mission, literally, to reduce health inequities for folks. So it provides us now with an opportunity and a platform to sort of say, let's go full bore, which we are, in the context of trying to figure out ways with not just the hospital, but with people on the east side of the campus, for example, who deal with urban issues, who deal with policies, trying to get all of us together on the same page to say, how can we do this and how can we afford it? Because it's tough. The one interesting thing is, I think we spent so much money in technologies, which, to be honest with you, I am a proponent of. So I'm going to tell you, I'm not anti-technologies because I do think that they have made healthcare better. But we have to figure out, how do you juxtapose that with the issues of, for example, maybe going into the library and the churches and doing primary, not just one event, but how do we actually do health education in their libraries, in the churches? Those things cost probably less, but they do cost. And so that's the biggest struggle. How does the Affordable Health Care Act opens up this amazing world of more people being insured, and it opens up an amazing world of putting more in preventive care, as opposed to when you come to the hospital, how do we keep you out of the hospital? I actually think those are all good things, but it's in the beginning. And so it's been difficult for a lot of health institutions to get our heads and hands around that, but you can't just scratch your head all the time. Sometimes you got to just get in there, roll your sleeves up, get something done, and then tweak it as we go along. And I think that that's what a lot of institutions are doing.
So how do you see that? How do you see that maybe 5-10 years down the road as we see, as we get past this implementation period? What role do you think, how does that change the focus for health institutions in terms of neighborhoods? You mentioned primary care, we've talked about preventative care, we haven't talked about behavioral health issues. Those are all, I think, three really important kind of parts of this.
Are very key. So I think in addition to primary care, and I failed to mention that mental behavioral health is a big issue within all of our communities. And obviously getting the right people to the communities to give that kind of help has been a struggle for years, but I think with the Affordable Health Care Act, I think that there's more emphasis on that. And I think that there will be, more 5 years from now, efforts put in that area as well. I do think that 5 years from now, what I'm hoping is that this 20th century model that we've had since the 1900s, of very big institutions and hospitals with lots of beds, the way you become a better hospital is to fill more beds, hopefully that's going to give way to much more of a sense of being part of the community by way of ambulatory centers or ambulatory hubs, where you not only have primary care, behavioral and mental health, but you have specialty care as well. In addition to sort of the specialty care, we're talking about integrating or embedding social services as well in those types of deals. So you get away from the model, I hope 5 years from now, of having this sort of very big and clunky sort of system, give way to a much more nimble system that is focused not so much on beds, although we'll always need beds, but it's focused on how do we get the care, the appropriate care at the right time when people need it as close to their communities as possible.
I think one of the things I learned in being on Daley Plaza for 13 years is the people who are homeless teaching me that I had no idea what they're dealing with in terms of mental health and physical health. It completely outstripped anything that I knew. And I didn't have any place to refer them where they could actually go, and I knew that they got there. And an awful lot of their medical care was at Cook County Emergency Room, which I'm sure costs a whole lot more than coming over to the base of the Moreau statue and sitting down with them and figuring out something I couldn't help them figure out. So somewhere along the line, what you're talking about in showing up where they are as much as them getting to the West Loop or beyond is key, because it's otherwise there's a real bifurcation in who gets what kind of health care.
And I think we do have that. That's been it's been put in place since the 1960s, although we've not looked much at it in the 80s and 90s. But this concept of what London Baines Johnson put in place with the FQHCs, Federally Qualified Health Centers, which were originally started in the latter part of the 60s to actually address some of these issues on the war on poverty, turns out to be a fantastic infrastructure that may have been neglected. But it is an infrastructure in which people don't have a biopsy of their wallet before they can see a physician. It's a place where if we actually figured out how to, particularly in the Chicago area with Congressman Davis and lots of other people, and I mean, Senator Griffin, are big champions of the concept of having these community health centers. The question becomes, how do we get our folks in our communities to access that more, and how do we get connected to, the religious institutions, the social institutions a little bit better, so we are talking in the context of how to actually add that realm, if you will, to our communities. I think that's the exciting part about what's happening, and I think that's where the big hope is.
Let's go back to these sort of external macro forces and how that plays a role in libraries, nonprofits, faith institutions, schools. What other external forces are you all seeing, whether for the good or not so, in terms of how that filters down to the neighborhood level?
Well, I mean, the major one, which is probably, there are macro forces in terms of policy changes that in a perfect world you can either influence on the front end or help mediate on the back end. There are other kinds of macro forces like what's going on with the economy, which tend to have an outsized impact on sort of the more, isolated and challenged a community is frequently their lows are lower, their highs are not as high, and they come more slowly, and so that you're sort of constantly in catch-up mode that are trickier too. I mean, so that what you want to do is at least try to influence the ones that you can. I mean, at its best, public policy is responding to local needs, and you've got, organized community voice and folks that are talking amongst themselves, and where ideas that will address those needs are pushing up, as opposed to that you're responding to these. It's harder when that's an economic when it's an economic challenge. I mean, all the communication in the world isn't going to change the fact that we have taken a lot of money out of. We've been borrowing money on the backs of social service. We've been putting a lot of money, less money into social services generally. We've cut $1 billion from education in Illinois alone in the last 3 years. That is simply making a difficult job that much harder. And so the need to have conversations, say, like, what's going to be our protective community response to these issues, again, my thesis, and I feel like I'm in an academic research, one institution, I should have a thesis. It's not as well founded as all these papers you read, is that the more that you've got that connective tissue, the more you've got, common cause and conversations among leadership within a community level, the more it feels like a community, it functions like a community, the more you can try and push at the front end and mitigate the back end. But some are just flat out in the economic, I would point to as swamping so much other good, positive, forward-looking. It's just much tougher to do in the kind of economic environment that we've seen of late.
Not far from here was a place called Marcy Newberry Center, which is not unlike Hull House. And it served a local population, primarily doing Head Start program for the school that was across the street on Maxwell Street, and a residential program for young mothers with children, and a number of other basketball programs and all. And it was very much close to the ground, getting stuff done. And then the population was displaced. It was moved elsewhere. And the institution couldn't follow to wherever they went fast enough anyway. So presumably the kids still needed Head Start, and maybe they got it, maybe they didn't, but the institution couldn't follow. Maybe the young mothers still needed the care and attention and encouragement that they were getting here, but they may or may not be getting it there, wherever there is. But now Marcy Newberry's out of business. Hull House is out of business. And those were decisions made about migrating populations, not necessarily made decisions by the people who are migrating, but by reconfiguring neighborhoods in the city.
One example that I think is interesting to me when we look at a city like Chicago, really any city in the United States, we think about this new digital world that we live in. Chicago is one of the leading global cities in this sort of flattening knowledge and information economy. I think we spend less time, or probably should be spending more time, thinking about what does that mean in terms of the skill set and the education and the access that we need to have across the city in order to really support that new economy. And Chicago has one of the fastest growing tech sectors in the country. It's part of our strategy to make ourselves competitive in a digital economy. But at the neighborhood level, we have a really big problem in terms of the widening gap of access and skills. And a few really, I think, just anecdotal examples with the healthcare reform, lines around the block of people coming into the library to get on and apply for benefits. These are folks in many cases that before they can get on to benefits, they have to have access. But guess what? Many of these folks didn't know how to use a mouse. And you think about the world of applying for a job or creating a business, you need access and a basic set of digital skills, and we need to make those investments as a city if we really want to be a global connected city. The Department of Housing is about to release or open up enrollment for the voucher program, and we've been meeting with them because the last time the voucher program opened in 2010, lines around the block at Harold Washington Library, people just waiting to get on a computer, and it's not just getting on to apply for those benefits, it's getting actually the basic help that you need in order to get onto a computer, use a mouse, and fill in those blanks. And guess what? Chicago, we provided almost 3 million internet sessions last year, and those internet sessions are limited to 1 hour per day. And can you imagine what it would be like for those of us who are looking at our devices right now if we only had an hour today to connect to the internet, when that's the only way to apply for a job, that's the only way to get benefits. And so as we think about how we position our city to be a strong global leader, when we think about what it's going to take in terms of kids and adults to have the skills and access they need, I think it's an increasing problem that we really need to address. And I think our city is addressing it, but to me that's a big one.
And I think in a health realm, there's some things that are just simply out of our hands at this point. The reimbursement. Since the 60s, we've mostly got reimbursed for taking care of really sick people. In fact, you talk about why there are less primary care physicians as opposed to super subspecialists, and I hate to tell you that, although I love pulmonary and critical care, and that is what I went into, and I love lung cancer research, and it was just fascination. But for many of my colleagues, there's this very, very, very real pressure to say, well, why would you go to primary care when the reimbursement is not so good? Why would you go to primary care where really you're not really all that well respected? Well, that, interesting enough, is tied into the reimbursement, which is silly. Because personally, I did this or became a physician, honestly, to serve. And I don't really care, to be quite honest with you, and I'll say this, because I'm saying it, I guess, live, that in front of a public, that whether I don't really care, the money isn't the issue for me, it's the ability of being able to serve others. that really drives me, and I think drives many of the younger people who are now coming online who want to honestly serve people. But the issue becomes, we have these fresh young faces and all this energy and people who are do-gooders, beyond do-gooders. And they get in a system where we have no control over the reimbursements. I can't say to someone, you know, it would probably cost you 10 times less if we were able to focus.
All right, it's down. So
And not have
The good
this
news is you
come
don't
down.
need health care.
Yeah, just so much for healthcare.
So
Yeah,
much for
but-
healthcare. And in fact, the
Where's
interesting
physics?
that's right, exactly. And the interesting thing is, we've been focused so much on the high cost, high tech, that it turns out that if we probably focused more of our attention on being in the community, focusing on the issues that the community sort of brings forth to us, we'd probably do much more with preventive care, primary care, mental health up front, some of the specialty that are needed up front. We'd probably save so much money that at the end of the day, we'd sort of say, with these extra resources, what could we do with them? That's been the disappointment, is that I think physicians and, you know, care providers as a whole tend not to really want to ever think about money. But when you have to think about, my note has to have all these exact things in it, not because it documents the care that another
you're not gonna get
provider
paid.
needs, but because you're not going to get paid. There's something wrong with that. Now, that's a bigger discussion, but to be honest with you, I take my hats off to all providers that even within that system, there is a modicum of humanism that says, despite all this craziness, I show up every day because my job and what I want to do, my advocation, is to take care of others. It's been a struggle, though.
let's shift here for just a moment, because Brian, there's something you said just about Chicago being known as a global city in terms of technology. One thing I think Chicago's also been known for historically is sort of our continuous immigration. We've always been known as a city of immigrants. And when you look at, in particular, the great white papers that have come out of this forum that everyone will be able to look at, Nick Theodore had this notion of the migrant civil society. And I just wanted to kind of bring that into the conversation as well. As we look at immigrants and the very rich and varied resources that are happening and sort of the within neighborhoods, and again, kind of getting back to our notion of those forces in neighborhoods, whether they're conflicting or not. I'm curious sort of the role you see immigrants playing throughout as a force, either on its own or through your institutions and your groups.
I think immigrants show up with food, language, and religion and family. And it's interesting to me to watch the second generation, third generation, and how quickly they do or do not assimilate to the American culture. Religious institutions often reflect that first generation. Now, how does the congregation as such change over time? What does it provide in terms of being an anchoring point to stable ways, and also how does it provide a change? Because oftentimes the religious institutions become an impediment to change because of they're conservative by definition. And so I think that's part of the given. But also there is a sense in Chicago that the whole population is migrating from one place to another. It's not just an in-migration from outside in, but in the rural community I served 40 years ago, you'd have 3 or 4 generations of the same family sitting in church on Sunday. Now you may have one person there for 4 weeks before they move to another town. So there is a tremendous movement around that is historically around ethnicity and other things, but even within the city, there's a great deal of change.
So, I mean, I think that it's a great question related to kind of the future of our city, and you know, there's a lot been written about sort of what makes up or sort of the characteristics of someone who leaves their home in search for a better life somewhere else. And you know, while I don't want to overly generalize, there's a huge opportunity for Chicago in welcoming new Americans, and I know the mayor is really interested in Chicago being, you know, the most friendly city, and that's I think an important strategy, though. If you think about if there's a way that we in our neighborhoods can thoughtfully understand the experience of people who are coming to us new, whether they're coming to us new from another neighborhood or coming to us new from outside the state or our country, there is huge opportunity to get folks feeling like they're welcome, giving them access to the tools and resources they need to find success. And if we do that well, I think there's a big part of our future as a successful city that's embedded within that. And again, I think the library is an interesting place to do some of those on-ramping pieces. It's also one of the challenges is you know, as we see the changes in our neighborhoods, one of the things that's really important for any institution, the library being one of them, is that we don't become fixed, right? That we're not just the neighborhood that serves this demographic or this type of person, that we're really constantly surveying, understanding, seeing the trends and changes so that we're you know, adapting the services to meet those demands. And that's an ongoing problem, I think, or a challenge and opportunity that we see in libraries. And I think in some areas we're doing that well, in other areas we have some room for improvement.
I wonder if we could talk about the neighborhoods. I don't think you can have a conversation about livable neighborhoods without discussing neighborhoods in Chicago that have some serious challenges. And you know, we have discussions of neighborhoods that are under-resourced, and I wonder if we can, you know, and Robin, I wonder if you want to start specifically, you know, you mentioned North Lawndale a couple of times. What does it look like when you say the neighborhood is under-resourced? What does that really mean?
I would add to it, I wouldn't limit to under-resourced. I'd say one of the other challenges is isolation, that you have neighborhoods that are not necessarily connected to. I think in a healthy, you know, functioning, a neighborhood has a lot of good things that are going on within it that are very supportive of what have good solid institutions. People can get the health care they can need, they get a good strong education, there are places to play, there are places to go out to dinner to celebrate, you know, a birthday, things like that, that when you don't have the kind of investment that some neighborhoods have, you don't see those things. But it's also a level of isolation. So while you want that to be healthy, you want people to be, there a lot of free flowing. It's not that every one of the interactions you have is within this neighborhood, right? You may go someplace else to work, may go someplace else to study, you know, when you're older. And I think that isolation is a huge problem. I think sometimes people don't know what's out there and what's possible. I think outside resources and issues don't come in. I mean, the hyper-segregation that is been the sort of millstone around Chicago's neck for a long, long time means that people who have means, people who are voting, people who make investment decisions, people who are otherwise more political, really don't necessarily, they can go a day, a week, a month, a year, their lives without really interacting in a meaningful way with issues and people who have very different circumstances than their own, and vice versa. That's not healthy. And that leads to a different mindset. When there is more of a free flow and mix, I think that people just tend to behave differently and think differently, et cetera. So the fact that we've got very isolated communities goes hand in hand with the fact that they're under-resourced, because you know, one of the papers talks about the fact that you need not equal resourcing in a city like Chicago, you need a very differential type of resourcing. That if we know that there are neighborhoods that are missing basic building blocks of infrastructure that are holding back the ability of kids and families to really lead healthy, productive lives, it's not going to take a little incremental change, you know, and foundations and social service agencies are doing everything they can to try and meet that. But honestly, without public investment, you can't get there from here. You just can't get there from here. So I think that isolation, the people who are making those decisions are not as invested, involved, and aware, means that we are making investment decisions that don't match those needs. And we're paying a price that, again, gets hidden.
Well, and I think a really good point of this, and I think it's important to point out that every neighborhood, obviously, even if we're going to use the label under-resourced or isolated, has also very specific issues. Neighborhood-specific issues, right? So I'd encourage you guys, as we're thinking about this, if you want to offer specific examples that are, I think, particularly relevant to one community, that's really helpful as well.
So I was just thinking about that. We have with UI Health a system of a partnership with FQHCs called Miles Square. They're in Englewood, South Shore, back of the yards, Cicero, and over here near West. We had an incident in which in South Shore, and both Englewood, but we'll focus on South Shore for a second, where the staff at one of my Miles Square centers had to deal with essentially random bullets going through the window. Now imagine you wake up in the morning, you're really dedicated, you're going to this clinic to really give the care that folks so desperately need, particularly around that South Shore region, and the very first thing you're having to do is you see a bullet come through the window and ultimately through the door, and you're having to get one, your senses back. 2, everyone in a safe zone with not only the patients but your staff. And 3, what do you do after that? And so these are very real issues that the violence, and I know that the mayor and others are trying desperately to do things about this context of gun violence within our city. That's a very real one for me. You know, because it directly impacted on that day the fact that we had to shut down the clinic. We had issues of whether we should even be there or not. We resolved that issue by sort of saying, with much resolve, that first of all, bullet or not, we're going to be there. The reality is we're going to be there. That South Shore needs an anchor, and for doggone it, we're going to be there and we're going to do our job.
And it's a great example of how this stuff interacts. So that how much interaction you've got between different neighborhoods where this is happening and where it's not happening has something to do with how high a priority does that end up being. It's taken much too long for this issue to get to the level of attention and focus. It still ain't going to be easy to fix. And it's also got all these collateral effects, right? Because you want to have great people in that clinic. God knows that's where you'd want your most talented folks. But now, how many people are going to choose to probably getting paid less to work there? Right? They don't get to stop at Starbucks, right, around the corner or whatever. I mean, the little things that make decisions about where the quality of our workplace, et cetera, are a little bit more challenging. Now you're going to add on top of that, you could have a bullet coming through there. I mean, it doubles down. It creates the isolation, and instead of making it easier for there to be more intercourse and more interaction, it actually makes it tougher, which again means that the issues don't get the primacy and the attention that they deserve, and so the cycle repeats.
All roads lead to the loop, but not equally. It'd be interesting to look at the transportation patterns and see where are the buses, where are the trains, where are the stations that are well kept and well served, because it's clear that there are metro trains that swoop in from Lake Forest. There are not any trains swooping in from Englewood, I would suspect. And so here you've got the middle of the city and all these transportation possibilities, and the city trying to do better things with its bus transportation. But I think that has to be very carefully watched. Is this equally accessible and available to people, including accessibility in terms of handicap accessibility and all? And I don't know where the wisdom of that pattern is being designed. I know that there's a lot of sort of practical, let's fix this, let's fix that, let's move this to that lane and that to there. It doesn't seem like there's a real coherent sense of something that's really important.
And by the way, it may mean a different take on what's important. We were talking earlier, Brian and I, historically Douglas Branch Library in North Lawndale had one of the lowest circulation rates in the city, so it's always sort of, on somebody's chopping block, but you can't afford, and so you might have to, and same with some metro lines. People are like, well, but it's not being used as much, I can't really justify it. Well, that's one way of looking at it. But if you look at it differently and say, what would it do to that community if I pulled that library out, if I pulled that branch out? What would it do to this neighborhood's present as well as its future if I pulled that stop? You have to think more broadly. And Brian quickly said, yes, but there are other measures. How connected, how many people are using computers, what's the trend stuff
as well, right?
And yet that wasn't the primary data point that really people were looking at. And it turns out there are better ways to think about it. And particularly if you're thinking about it from a neighborhood point of view, as opposed to just standing back and very clinically saying, I can't justify not enough people checking out books down there,
Well, just being a librarian, I had to check my data.
I know you did that right away.
And it turns out, so it is true that Douglas has lower use in terms of the checkout of materials, but it turns out the Douglas Branch Library has among the highest use of computers, has among the highest door count that we have of branch libraries that size. And it actually spoke with the folks who run the branch right after they spoke with me on the phone. And it turns out, like, it's just used in a very different way than what you would see in some other neighborhoods where people are just coming in, picking up their holds, going home, and and cooking, which is it's a perfectly legitimate way to use the library, but it's used differently in that neighborhood, and we need to make sure that we're looking at the right data points.
And when you say door count, that's literally people coming through the
Number
door.
who just walk through the door.
And that's one of the highest in the city.
One of the highest for its size.
Wow.
Yeah. So if you're just looking at circulation, you're really not telling the story. And I think, again, it gets into that question of like how we really study and understand who we're serving, how we're serving them. And certainly if you look at data patterns within our libraries, that we actually just did a big analysis of our computer usage. What we found is that we do have libraries that computer utilization is around 50%. versus other libraries where it's more like 80 or 90%. And so the question for us is, do we want to be doing some distribution of computers, the one-on-one homework, computer support that we provide. We have these supported the Library Foundation. They're called Cyber Navigators to do one-on-one computer instruction. Should we be deploying those? And I think the challenge is that, and I've actually seen this in Chicago as well, and is that when you look at all these different resources, whether it's schools or libraries, or if you look at issues related to violence, sometimes we're looking at just one piece of data and using that data to tell a story, and sometimes that isn't the actual accurate story. And we should be really probably holding ourselves more accountable to understand the real questions and actually looking at the data points that can help us find the right solutions.
As we're speaking of stories, I wonder if each of you could share a neighborhood-specific story that you think fits into this conversation about livable neighborhoods and how you see something, just something remarkable, a way that it's working well or not.
I can start with two quick upbeat things. I feel like I was being a little negative before, and I'm a glass half full kind of person at heart.
Don't worry, I have one last positive question at the end, so you can negative out.
When things are working well, we talked before about these macro forces, and wouldn't it be much better if major policy decisions are coming, bottom up? And one, the issue of domestic violence, which is an issue in a lot of, it's not even a neighborhood issue, right? That's just an issue. But it plays out a little bit differently in a neighborhood like North Lawndale, where you have a lot of women who may be on public aid, and they're finding out why is the reporting and why is the use of domestic violence services so much lower. And it turns out that people are very unwilling to report that there's a man in their life in their home because that will jeopardize public aid. And so we were able to come up with a solution, which then got adopted citywide and I think statewide, where there were two separate intake people, so there was a Chinese wall. So I could tell you, yes, there is somebody, without jeopardizing my public aid, but I could let you know that, yes, there's a man in my home and there's a person in my life. I shouldn't be assuming that domestic violence always goes that way. My apologies to men in the audience, though it does mostly go that way. That they could actually talk about that and get themselves the help and the support that they needed without jeopardizing, which otherwise, they couldn't responsibly do for kids. So it was just a little thing, but it ended up working for the community and then going system-wide, which was kind of cool.
As I sort of say, again, it may be my holy-doly Colorado roots kind of coming out here in the sense of my optimism, but I am very optimistic, and I think for some real reasons. The concept that I've been talking about of getting closer to those communities isn't just sort of in the abstract for me. I live that. That example of South Shore and being in South Shore is very central to me and to, I think, the university's sort of mission and being there. The interesting thing is we've also recognized that they have more than just usually a typical problem of health. It's usually resources of even getting good food or exercise. So we're becoming a loud advocate and a voice, working hopefully with the city and sort of saying, as we look at these health centers that are being placed, we also have to figure out who should we partner with. That's a new way of looking at things. Who should we partner a bit with to sort of talk about what food issues should go in, or what low cost exercise facilities could go in so that that fits the community. The other thing is, I'm really excited about what just happened in January 6th of this past year. We opened up at Miles Square on Roosevelt and Wood this really fascinating building that says, why not challenge what federally qualified health centers could do for folks? And why not get beyond underserved and literally talk about underserved and as underserved as being part of the community? Because when we talk about underserved, it's as if we sort of partition them out and, well, then there's a rest. When I take care of a patient, I take care of a patient. It doesn't matter where they kind of come from. For me, we now have an institution right in Roosevelt and Wood that's what I call the grand experiment, where we have our departments of medicine, our department of surgery, our department of pediatrics, radiology, many other people that tended not to gravitate and work with primary care to say, not only do we want to be there, but we need to be there because we want to serve too. That's something very exciting that's happening here in Chicago. Now, you can look all over the country and say, well, that's probably done. That's not done. The opening of an urgent care, and I'm going to probably get on my soapbox, but the reality is the urgent care and immediate care that we actually have now in Chicago area, it's amazing to me that people don't know that they actually have access to this, and probably talk about reduced cost and reduced time for waiting. But we as a city and we as health institutions have not educated people to say, if you have a sore throat, you probably don't have to wait 8 hours in an emergency room. But we have to be the resource for them to say, well, where's the nearest urgent care center? The crazy thing about opening up this urgent care center, talk about bringing people together for us, which is why it's really, it's great for me, is that we now have people who I know have probably the gold platter insurance, and people with no insurance all getting their care in a facility, elbow to elbow, shoulder to shoulder, and not mattering. And some even sort of saying, you know what a nice facility. In fact, I know I've been seen down somewhere north, but maybe I'll just come here to get my care because it's in the neighborhood. That's neighborhood care. Right? And so I'm really excited for us in Chicago and us as a state that we actually have these couple grand experiments that are underway, and I'm keeping my fingers crossed that they're going to be successful.
Some of us are old enough to remember and still young enough not to have forgotten Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, public broadcasting.
Also Presbyterian minister.
Yeah, Fred, yeah. The
Gift to that.
Reverend Fred Rogers. His ministry was to create a sense of unmerited, graceful acceptance for children. He talked about it as neighborhood, though in fact it wasn't proximity, it was electronic. But he was able to create a space where children felt that they were understood, that they were appreciated. Now, I contacted Father Michael Pfleger last week, who's one of my heroes, and asked him, what is St. Sabina's doing? Because I know they do so much in their neighborhood. And he gave me a list of 9 things that they do in the neighborhood, all of which, if you're going to give them dollar value, would be just off the chart. But the basketball program, which is probably best known, where they take gang members who would dismiss each other at least, and maybe more, on the street corner, and put them on the same team so they have to play together in this basketball league that goes year-round. Now, the Chicago Bulls and the mayor and others have paid attention to this. But it's an extraordinary opportunity for St. Sabina's to do something that's visionary, against the flow, and demonstrate that there is a way in which you can belong and be accepted. Now, nobody's going to confuse Michael Pfleger with Mr. Rogers. But that's only because we lack the imagination. They're really operating on the same side of the street.
Brian, do you have a story? I feel like I would be remiss of public radio if I didn't allow you to also share a story. Where you're at.
You know, there's just so many. I'm flooded with stories. You know, one recently, I was we offered a tour of the Harold Washington Library to FCC Commissioner Clybourne as part of a analysis of E-rate reform, which is something that libraries and schools get. And what was really fun about it is that, you know, we do tours all the time, and she hadn't been to a library in a while, and we went to the 3rd floor, which is our computer commons, and it's a large room. There's about 150 computers. They were all full. People, you know, the activity. And I think she was sort of surprised. Like when you actually walk into a room and you say, wow, that many people are looking for a computer today, and they're waiting in line to get on it. It sends a really, I think, if you haven't visited the Harold Washington Library recently, you go check it out. What was fun about that is that we were able to walk across the hall to our advanced manufacturing lab and to the other end of the spectrum, that in addition to teaching basic mouse skills and getting people online, the library is also becoming a place where you can use a 3D printer, a milling machine, and learn about these emerging technologies that we believe are really the future of our city. And then we headed downstairs to our digital media and learning space for teenagers, which was also filled with a bunch of kids after schools. And it was a whole series of workshops. There was kids who were learning 3D printing. There was a group of kids who were in a recording studio, another group of kids who were playing on games. And, you know, to me, what was fun about it is that's a library that I didn't grow up in. And for whatever reason on that particular day, probably because we had a fresh audience in Commissioner Clybourne, is that it sort of reminded me that we've come a really long way. And while our mission hasn't changed, the way that we perform that mission has changed in the context of where we are today. And so I think that, you know, Chicago in a lot of ways, certainly in libraries, I know them well because I lead them in Chicago, but I think there's many aspects of our city where we're doing a lot of the right things. And sometimes moments like that are good reminders of it.
Brian, you may have answered this, but this is the last question I just wanted to ask all of you. You know, as we're wrapping this up and we're thinking about your organization, at its best, what role do you think your organization can play in creating livable neighborhoods in Chicago? And this can be, you can answer this sort of in the future as well, as it doesn't have to be right now.
it probably won't surprise you that I think again, one of the roles that foundations can play is connective, both within communities and then across. And when you do that at your best, it's being led by where's the leadership in the community, where are the urges and the needs and the felt priorities there, and then you're making it easier for them to connect to the folks that are going to help them solve those issues and problems, and then help connect up where you need to, or out where you need to, or bring in resources where you need to support that. I can give examples, but we're probably running low on time.
No, go ahead.
I think that's really important. I mean, one of my favorites that North Lawndale had for years been on the critical list in terms of having early child care opportunities and slots for kids. And there were a number of organizations in the community that really understood that and wanted to solve that. But there was a very quick turnaround time to bring in a lot of public dollars to actually build facilities, and they weren't in a position to respond that quickly. And so we were able to work with a few of them to connect them to outside resources who could help them put together plans. So for a very small upfront investment in developing plans among people who were interested in helping to fill that need, they were able to successfully compete for dollars. And North Lawndale has now been off that list for some time, and that is a good thing. And again, it was, that isolation would have really been a stumbling block. And so I think that nonprofits and outside organizations that can help facilitate that goes a long way. It will never substitute for the things just working better in the public, but at least this way was a bridge to some of the public dollars and investments.
I'm no longer a minister in the Loop now. I retired 2 months ago, and Myron McCoy is doing a good job of getting all of that moving in a good direction downtown. I live on a lake in Wisconsin where I wake up now to the geese crying instead of the sirens wailing as it used to be down in the Loop. Same sound, actually. But there's something curious happening in that the Loop is becoming a neighborhood. There are 80,000 people who live within a 1-mile radius of Daley Plaza. 30 years ago, that was not true. In fact, the minister of that church, living in the steeple of that church 30 years ago, who had 4 children, public schools had no idea where to send them because they never imagined anybody would be living in that part of the city. But right now, when you go expand East Randolph, North Loop, South Loop, West Loop, everybody wants to be in the Loop, there are 80,000 residents, either second generation people coming in after selling their home somewhere, or young adults. In addition, there's 65,000 college students at several campuses, plus UIC, plus IIT. So it's very, very unusual to say, okay, now what is happening right now? It may be a neighborhood, but it's not a community. One thing that church and other such groups can do in the city center is provide sacred space and sacred time and safety and a sense of belonging. It's people are just crying for somebody knowing their name and somebody appreciating who they are and what they can do. And you're not going to hear that from the 5th floor of City Hall. You're not going to hear that from the 55th floor or whatever corporate office we're talking about. T.S. Eliot said, where's the knowledge we've lost in information? And where's the wisdom we've lost in knowledge? Information is very important. But wisdom has to be this, and we can't wait for wisdom to come from the 5th floor or the 55th floor. It's got to come from our talking with one another and our commitments, vocations, avocations, to make sure something happens that matters.
I think from our perspective, the biggest, brightest spot that would bring the biggest grin on my face is the day that I can sort of say that we really have access to not only health care, but wellness for all of our citizens within the city. And that it's not UI Health, it's UI Health along with community hospitals and other academic institutions and whoever who's bringing about that. But I think in addition to that, it would be wonderful if I'm able to sort of also say that we're connected to the communities because we're now connected by involving our communities with community healthcare workers, so that there's a new core, that we don't just say it's only nurses or only doctors or only this, but also that you're responsible for your own health and can actually guide your own health of your own communities by having community healthcare workers that are either extensions or interconnected with us. That would be a major victory. I think we'll get there.
So I think for libraries, Chicago Public Library is, in this moment, used more than it has any other point in our 140-year history. And I don't think that's by accident. I think that we are libraries, we sell ourselves short often. We are masters of evolution. Our missions haven't changed, and I think that if we look to the future of Chicago's libraries, my hope is that we'll stay true to our mission, we'll continue to evolve, and continue to play that really important role of being one of the pieces of connective tissue within a community neighborhood that is responsive. And I think if we do that well, hopefully a year from now, and 2 years, and 10 years from now, we'll be having record number use in the future. So hopefully we keep doing that well.
Well, thanks very much. Brian Bannon is the Commissioner of Chicago Public Library. Phil Blackwell is the recently retired Senior Minister for First United Methodist Church at the Chicago Temple. Robin Staines, thanks for providing two hats, both as from your role in Advance Illinois as well as with the Staines Family Foundation. And Rob Wynn is the Associate Vice President for Community-Based Practice and the Director of the Cancer Center at U of I's Hospital and Health Science Systems. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well done.
Thank you. Thank you for a stimulating panel and for introducing us to the subtext, which is the return of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. Nyla mentioned, those of you who don't know, Nyla mentioned that there are white papers that act as sort of the undergirding to this the conference. The 5 white papers are posted online in draft form. We have an agreement with the University of Illinois Press to publish those, and next year when you come back for the UIC Urban Forum in 2015, there will be a hard copy of the proceedings from this, the 5 white papers, as well as the overview of the conference that will be distilled by someone for us. I would ask all of you, I was asked by Susanna, do we have a break? We don't have a break, so if you would like to stand and stretch for a second while I introduce our first keynote speaker, you are certainly welcome to do that. It won't distract me. We reorganized the Urban Forum this year to accommodate 2 very fascinating keynote speakers, which I'm sure you're going to enjoy. We decided to put them between the 2 morning panels while we have you all in this room before we break out in the afternoon after lunch to the concurrent panels, which will be held in the rooms back on the west side of the building. So the first speaker today is Bridget Gaynor. Bridget is the Cook County Commissioner from the 10th District. Bridget's been engaged in her communities, both her professional community and the civic community, for decades, appreciating the value of neighborhoods and the particular challenges experienced by those with a declining population, abandoned properties, and vacant land. Commissioner Gaynor in 2013 introduced the Cook County Land Bank, which was approved by the Cook County Commission. Its purpose is to reduce the amount and impact of vacant land and abandoned buildings in the county, and to halt the decline and to rebuild neighborhoods. Commissioner Gaynor's understanding of the importance of strong neighborhoods, healthy neighborhoods, and her political will to move the policy needle forward to be addressing some of the challenges facing some of the county's neighborhoods make her an insightful, thoughtful, and dynamic keynote speaker on today's broad theme. Please welcome Commissioner Bridget Gaynor.
Good morning. Thanks everyone for having me. I've had the opportunity and the good fortune to meet and work with many of you in this room. So I appreciate you taking the time to listen to a topic about which we are all passionate, which is the neighborhoods of our city. So thanks again for having me. I want to thank the UIC Urban Forum, especially the forum that put this together. There are many wonderful people. President Prenkwinkle was on that, and she, as you know, is someone who has led this issue for many years. And to Dean Pagano, and for all the work that UIC does to invest in neighborhoods, and for inviting me here today. So it should go without saying, but since I get to make the keynote, I get to say it, that the collective output of the people in this room and everyone that we work with when we go back to wherever it is that we work, it's nothing short of life-changing. Community development, organizing, building neighborhoods, it's not for the faint of heart. In fact, it's probably more for the optimistically relentless than anything else. Some might say insanely relentless, but more on that later. When I saw the topic for today, neighborhoods as urban strategy, return to neighborhoods, it reminded me of that Vince Lombardi quote. And to paraphrase, if you care about cities like he cared about football, Neighborhoods aren't everything, they're the only thing. If you grew up in one that worked, if you live in one now or you work to make them so, you know that like a happy family, all good neighborhoods are alike. But it's the making of them that takes a lot of work. But that's not anything you don't already know. Much of what works and what doesn't is known to this crowd. We have learned some new things that don't work through the response to the financial crisis, and that has left us, a decade after the apex of the heyday, with a changed landscape that kept the old problems, lack of jobs, retail, failing schools, and added some new ones. And that's what I'd like to talk about today. This new landscape, literally, which we need to continue to work the traditional tools, organization, development, community engagement, but to those we need to add a new way of thinking about the elements of our political, visual, and financial landscape. We need a new vision, and yes, I said vision about demolition. We need to ask ourselves if tax and water liens on vacant housing should continue to be seen as a revenue raiser for local government. Should property taxes continue to be a profit center for a handful of well-financed, lobbied-up tax buyers? And something I wish we could take a vote on in this room, we need to have a radically different expectations about how our own federal government comes to the table when we talk about the neighborhoods that we love. But first, some context. 2 cities, and then some vision about Washington, and how there's a different way to think about how we take on the issue of vacant housing and its role in the life and death of this and other great American cities. So the first one was about New York. You know, many of us in the room are old enough to remember the famous headline from President Ford that said, to New York, drop dead. And it's hard to really recall that the New York of the 70s is related to this kind of drop dead fabulous city that we know about today. In 1979, New York owned 60,000 units of vacant housing. That didn't count all the occupied housing they owned as the operator of the public housing department. So as overall, they owned over 100,000 units of housing. So the city was the largest owner of vacant and occupied housing. So in response, Mayor Koch announced what would come to be known as the 10-year plan for housing. There was a 10-year plan, there were hundreds of programs, but the interesting thing that really came after, we spoke to people years and years later was one aspect that was really successful. The Koch administration made the strategic decision that back taxes and other liens like water liens would not be an impediment to development. We talk a lot in Cook County about our healthy tax base, a strong real estate mix, good collection rates, but this ignores all the property that we stopped counting, kind of like the unemployment rate, stops the people that, stops counting the people that aren't looking. The city and publicly owned land that does not appear on the tax rolls isn't counted, but they have liabilities that are hidden until they become an interest to a developer, community, or a profit or otherwise. Tens of millions of dollars sit on parcels and can be the difference of whether or not development takes place. We all understand the moral hazard of wholesale tax forgiveness, but I'd like to propose that we structure a different way to think about it. Abatements on vacant land and property tax, and maybe in a mirror image in the way we think about TIFs. In some way, as an asset. If you think about the total value of uncollected property taxes that sit on vacant lands, that sit there until someone is potentially interested in development, it can be the thing that either can incent the development or stop it from happening. So many of the margins of developments in our hardest hit communities are razor thin. And when you add on property taxes and water liens, they become impossible. So if you thought about that as a way to structure kind of an abatement credit, somewhat like a TIF, a little bit different, but municipalities need to recognize that like the value of mortgages that sat on bank balance sheets 5 years ago, 10 years ago, they don't hold the same value, but they are holding back development. We need to create a structure to take a write-down, kind of for lack of a better word, on the liability that we are unlikely ever to collect in certain communities. 10% a year, 20% a year, a fund that the city and the suburbs, the county would have to work with, that would give our planners, our corp council, our developers, a way to meet in the middle, and as with TIF funding or other subsidies, to build a pro forma that works. Bank of America, Chase, Citi, Wells, they've all had to take painful write-downs of the value of mortgages. The public sector has a balance sheet as well, and no one wants to give up on revenue. But if we don't plan for a way to use this liability as an incentive for development in our hardest hit communities, we're going to continue to keep them hostage to wishful thinking. When I think about resetting our municipal balance sheet, it leads us inevitably to challenge the federal government to do the same. As many of you know, the GSEs, Fannie and Freddie, as they are also known, are the largest holders of vacant land in Cook County. 80% of the mortgages, underwater or otherwise, are owned by Fannie Mae. We need to think differently about how quickly Fannie Mae can make a decision, what the valuation of that housing is. If I was less than the consummate professional that I am, I might say that I'd love to live in the world in which all the housing was actually valued at what it sits on a Fannie Mae balance sheet, but I will not. I think we need to look at challenging the federal government, challenging the GSEs in this moment where they are looking in the mirror and saying, what is their role in the future of housing? I do think there's a reason for hope. Mel Watt is the new head of the FHFA, which is the regulator of Fannie and Freddie. Fannie and Freddie are, for lack of a better term, they're investment vehicles. They have investors, and FHFA is their regulator. FHFA will be the one to decide what is the future of Fannie and Freddie. And that future is so important when we think about its impact on our hardest hit communities. So recently, Mel Watt announced that they would be coming, Fannie and Freddie and FHFA would be launching this strategic neighborhood initiative, Detroit, Chicago, Baltimore, and Miami. They're coming to Chicago next week. Many of you will probably be meeting with them. I am very hopeful that we can come to the table, take them on a tour, show them what we're working with, and really kind of bring them to the table to say, what we need is something different from you. And we also have the right to expect from our government at least what we have seen from some of these multinational financial institutions. And lastly, some interesting news from Detroit. You can't really have a discussion about vacant housing without talking about Detroit. But I recently met the mayor of Detroit. I don't know if any of you have had the pleasure of meeting Mike Dugan. He's an interesting guy. He ran for mayor. He got kicked off the ballot. I love this story because it reminds me of our own electoral politics. He gets kicked off the ballot in a petition challenge. He wins in a write-in with another guy whose name Mike Duggan just spelled differently. So I always, I liked him already before I even heard what he was doing in Detroit, which is mighty. So secondly, if you ever want to be cheered up about how things are in Chicago, you should spend some time talking to someone about Detroit. It all starts to look like wine and roses after about a couple minutes. But he is not despondent, and quite the opposite. He is energized, and it was actually hard not to be contagious. So one of the most interesting things they are doing relates to demolition. And, demolition is a long and storied and controversial development tool. For many years, our concept has been a knee-jerk reaction to either a safety emergency situation, and a lot of it kind of has echoes of the 1950s and 60s urban renewal blight elimination plans. They were wanting for strategy, but certainly not for action. They were fueled with an edict to tear down everything that looked unkempt or just an eyesore, and we lost so much. We gained things. We're sitting actually in a community right now that was both a victim, but then the output of that. But back to Detroit. They are now taking one neighborhood at a time, and interestingly, they're starting in their most stable communities. And they're coming in on a SWAT team approach. And for demo, rehab, and then side lot sales. In the space of a week, all vacant homes are tagged, owners of vacant homes are contacted, and can either enter into a consent agreement with the commitment to rehab and occupy that house within 6 months, or lose it to a nuisance lien in a court process. Homes that are taken through court process, and the city has won every single case that they have brought to the court on this nuisance lien. They are cleared of liens, and then they are auctioned on a website to people who will make the same rehab and occupancy commitment. Mike Duggan gave a legal basis that was rooted in English common law, which I will spare you, but it was actually kind of interesting. So Detroit in the last year, they've done this in 5 communities now. And all of this activity starts to happen at the same time. So they've seen a 60% increase in housing rehab in communities where the SWAT approach has taken place. They have access to hardest hit funds for demo, bank settlement funds, and other resources. And the city is making the investment that bet is going to pay off later. And there's also research backing this up. So as you can imagine, Michigan is somewhat of a hotbed of vacancy, abandonment, demolition research. There's an academic named Nigel Griswold. He's the principal of Griswold Consulting Group out of Michigan State. He recently issued a report on strategic demolition after studying the demolition effect in several Michigan cities. He found that reassessments after strategic demolition, when it was combined with this rehab approach, increased the value of surrounding property by 10.17% and brought the overall increased property values across the city. Nigel found that on average, each demolition created nearly $260,000 in value for properties on that same block. We need the cooperation of the court and the legal system, but if we start with the premise that communities can look different than they have in the past, yet still be successful, and that's why we think about this in terms of a new vision. We are in a time of flat population growth, maybe in some communities even loss. And creating a successful community may not mean replicating the housing density or population targets of earlier generations. You know, often when you talk to planners about Chicago, they will, you know, wax very eloquently about the beauty of our grid and the kind of organized systemic nature of it. But the architecture and the grid in Chicago was set up to address a couple major demographic factors. Huge waves of immigration that basically post the fire up until the 70s were a constant wave of people coming from all over the world to Chicago, and they came to our center city. The second was large family size and accommodating that, you know, the early household formation in large families. Neither one of those things are really relevant in our city today or in really almost any city. We don't have waves of immigration. When people do come to Chicago, they spread out throughout the entire region. There's huge immigration to the suburbs. And our family size is different. You know, I look at my own family as an example. My mother grew up in Englewood. She was one of 10 children, an immigrant family on a block of mostly immigrants. I'm one of 6, and I have 3. I certainly don't hearken back to the days of 10 children. So we need to start thinking about this differently. We can't be focused on the fact that the only way to have a successful community is to replicate the density of the 60s or the 50s or even the 70s. We have a fantastic grid, we have a fantastic architectural structure, but we need to work it out so that the architecture fits the people and we don't try to make the people fit the architecture. We are very good in Chicago and many other cities at managing increasing demands for housing, increasing density, growing commercial great density, but we've yet to figure out how to manage decline without it equaling failure. It doesn't mean reduction in population, doesn't mean sacrificing the quality of life for neighborhoods. So how does this relate to life on the ground? About a year ago, Ben Bernanke gave a speech where he spoke about Jane Jacobs' 1961 book, Death and Life of Great American Cities. He noted that in that book, she celebrated the complexity and organic development of city neighborhoods, in which intricate social networks enhance the safety, quality of life, and economic opportunity. In Jacobs' view, a police force was not nearly as effective at maintaining order as a neighborhood filled with public actors, such as storekeepers, doormen, interested neighbors acting as street watchers at all hours. The development of this sort of community, self-monitoring, is most likely to emerge, she argued, in neighborhoods with a rich mixture of activities taking place in buildings of various age, character, and use. Bernanke went on to say that for the most part, social science research has vindicated Jacobs' perspective. He gave the example of sociologists studying community resilience in the wake of natural disasters. These sociologists focused on deaths caused by an extreme heat wave in Chicago in '95. Many of us remember that. The sociologists found, not surprisingly, that death rates were higher in lower income communities where air conditioning was scarce. But they also noticed a remarkable difference in the fatality rate in one neighborhood, specifically Auburn Gresham, which, as you know, is on the south side. While comparable to many measures in other neighborhoods all over Chicago and suburbs of similar housing stock, similar numbers of elderly residents, and comparable rates of poverty and unemployment, Auburn Gresham had among the lowest fatality rates in the city, 3 deaths per 100,000. Researchers found that a key difference between Auburn Gresham and other neighborhoods lay in its physical and social topography, vitality of sidewalks, stores, restaurants, community organizations that brought friends and neighbors together, making it easier for people to look out for each other. So if we start with the premise that when you have a strong community of people, we have a neighborhood, then we have to look no further than for an answer of how to revitalize our neighborhoods than the people living in them. Our greatest strength for renewal doesn't come from legislation, and it's helped by new programs, but it's focused on the men and women who live beside the vacant lots and abandoned homes, but still chose to pay their mortgage on time. If we are going to be successful in our roles as facilitators of programs, we must first acknowledge and build upon the men and women who serve as the unofficial neighborhood watches, the neighbors who know everyone and would rather have you move into their own house than sit in a fatal heat. In my role as starting the Land Bank over the last couple of years, I've had an amazing opportunity to work with so many people talking about community development. And as you know, any effort that evolves over time is one that's built stronger because it really comes from the opinions and the insights of hundreds of people that made it happen. So in all of that time, I know that we have this foundation. We have no shortage of neighbors, community organizations, churches, and block clubs willing to be change agents. We just have to create the tools that make them be successful. We can't have one hand tied behind their back. We have to be ready to implement plans, to think differently about some of these things that we think are givens and are unchangeable, and we need to employ them in our neighborhoods. Community development just isn't a buzzword. It's got to be an action plan. And it requires that we're all talking to each other and making new demands on ourselves and our partners. So in closing, I hope that everyone here leaves here and remembers that story from Auburn Gresham and is reminded that our job isn't to recreate neighborhoods in the way they looked in the past. It's support communities by doing the right thing, by challenging each other's, and by focusing on how we can think differently in the future. It's the people that are the string that hold the fabric of the communities together. Our challenge here today and each day after is to draw from these lessons of the past, but not let us shackle each other from planning for the future. So as someone who was born and raised in a fabulous neighborhood in the city, someone who lives in one today, and whose whole measure of success for myself is whether or not my children choose to return to the city and make their own life here, I am grateful for Chicago in 2014, for the places that you in this room and others have created, and for beyond, and for all that you do. So let's get to it. Thanks.
Thank you, Commissioner Gaynor. That was really great. When the sun shines here, it's not God saying he wants to burn us. He sees us all with bright futures. With these powerful words, a group of fifth graders from the Bradwell School of Excellence in the South Shore neighborhood provided a counter-narrative to the shootings and the violence that too often capture headlines and break hearts across the city. Our focus on random violence washes away the random acts of kindness, joy, and decency that make up the majority of any given day in any given neighborhood. In July of this year, 28 fifth grade students from the Bradwell School told the world that you don't really know us. Their full essay is printed in your program, and if you haven't read it yet, I highly encourage you to do so. The children end their essay noting that their neighborhood is filled with love, that it is their home. It is my deep honor to introduce Miss Lindsay Rose, the fifth grade teacher at Bradwell, and three of her former students, Damiante Rogers, Rondale Sanders, and Savion Kemp, now sixth graders, who will provide a keynote presentation. Welcome.
My name is Lindsay Rose. I'm lucky to have spent the last 5 years of my life with fifth graders as a teacher at Bradwell School of Excellence in the South Shore neighborhood of Chicago. Last year, we began reading a novel by Sherman Alexie, The Absolutely True Diary of a Part-Time Indian. In the book, the main character, an adolescent named Junior, who lives on the Spokane Indian Reservation, struggles with conflicting feelings about his home. It was a place for him that was rich with culture and love, but outsiders characterized it as worthless and uncivilized. In the end, Junior becomes compelled to leave the reservation in search of hope and attend the rich white school while still living on the reservation. As we read, something magical happened. The students began to identify the reservation as their own neighborhood, and Junior as a trusted friend who gave voice to a part of their lives, their own struggle. This connection with the text became the fodder for many rich conversations. And during one of these, I asked my students, do you live in a poor neighborhood? It started as a seemingly simple question, but I wasn't prepared for the answer. And I began feverishly recording their fascinating responses. They unanimously said no, this is not a poor neighborhood. They acknowledge that people think it's poor, and they know there's trash and abandoned buildings and heartbreak, as Damiante put it. But it's not a poor neighborhood. They cited various evidence from their lives as rationale. I was confounded. I spent a few days trying to figure out who was wrong. Is it possible that the neighborhood isn't really poor like we've always heard, or were my students misguided? I soon realized that I too had fallen victim to the prevailing narrative, and had allowed outsiders to determine all the adjectives to describe my students' home. So we began seeking ways to change that narrative, to allow the people who live there to tell their story of the neighborhood with the adjectives and nouns and verbs of their choice. The students' op-ed that's in your program arose from that, and I'm so grateful for the organizers of the conference who have further empowered our young people and amplified their voices here by inviting them to share a glimpse into their lives as 11 and 12-year-olds growing up in Chicago. So first up we have Rondell.
Hi, I'm Rondell Sanders. I'm 12 and have lived in Chicago my whole life. I'm smart, I love to eat, and I'm a vegetarian. My life in South Shore is made up mainly of 3 things: family, school, and basketball. Family. I could actually see my mom trying. She shows support, always trying to be there whenever she can. The other day she came to hear me speak, but she was late, but she still tried to come. I also have 3 brothers. It's automatic that my brothers and I have a special relationship. We're with each other 24/7. We play basketball together and have 4 controllers so we can play all the games. 99% of the time, whatever I do, they do. I invest time in learning new ways I can get A's in school. I'm looking forward to school already. I'm going to change those grades until I get all A's. I'm not going to be satisfied. If it was up to me, I'd stay in school the whole weekend. For me to get through school, I need the teacher support. I think it's important to have a good relationship with the teacher so that you can know what you need to do in class and that the teacher believes in you. Basketball is the sport I'm really into. When I play basketball, it reminds me of my dad every time, because every time I see him, we play. I'm able to release stress when I go outside to play football. Playing sports made me feel free. This essay we wrote feels like an extra voice. It's a second voice. Whatever feels important to me, I can say because it's going to be heard. I'm accomplishing a lot of things. I want to tell the people about the things you can accomplish. On the news the other day, it showed a kid who had a scholarship to play football but decided to be a rapper. They showed that on the news, but not the person who decided to take the scholarship. I think it's important for the kids to see the good things about what's going on. I also think adults and kids need to step up because in order for them to start showing the positive things, we need to start doing positive things. Sometimes I wonder when I grow up how I'm going to look back at this. I wonder if I'm going to come back to the community. I wonder where I'm going to start giving back to the neighborhood. There are a lot of charities in the community. Where are you going to start? Your neighbors, schools, park district? Well, I know after I take care of my family, I will get back to my school, the park district, and the community because these are the resources that once gave to me.
My name is Savion Kim. I'm 11 years old. I lived most of my life in Chicago, South Shore neighborhood. If you want to get to know me and my neighborhood, I will take you to my school. I feel supported when I go to school because when I learn new things, it makes me feel powerful, like I'm smarter than I was. Then I will take you to my block, Birmingham. On my block, there's a lot of people with careers. The man across the street owns an auto shop. My dad's friends on Essex has his own business. If you come, you will see that people have careers. You'll see that connection with each other in the neighborhood and other neighborhoods. People just walk their dogs and don't say much. When we walk to stores, we interact with people. That's why I have lots of friends and stuff like that. Then are good places and good times, and people try to stop the violence and love each other. The most important thing I do in my neighborhood are watch my little brothers and sisters and play football. Being a big brother is so much responsibility. When you have younger siblings, understand you, whatever you do, they do. So it's important that they see me playing football and doing my homework. When you are a son, your parents look at you and make sure your brothers and sisters are straight. Besides being a big brother, playing football is most important part of my life. Through football, I learned to work hard and learn discipline. Instead of being lazy, we get to be active, learn new things, and takes my mind off the other things because I'm always practicing or at a game. I want to grow up here because I really have a feeling that I'm going to be successful. If I get to be somebody, it will change. Everyone's thinking this neighborhood is not just violence, but there are people who got to be something. I think people act like that because they don't think they can get anywhere in life. I'll be evidence that you can be somebody if you actually work hard. You can get to be something. I want to be a big brother to anyone in my neighborhood, not just to my siblings, but to everyone who looks up to me.
My name is Demiante Rogers. I am 12 years old. I have lived almost all my life in Roseland and South Shore neighborhoods of Chicago. People probably think those are bad neighborhoods. People are shooting and people are dead on the news. I want you to know there are good parts. There's a man and a lady who live by my auntie's house on Phillips. If there's anything going on, the block they come out and help people to resolve the problem. They don't yell, they calm people down, encourage people to do the right thing. There's a man who gives out dollars to the kids by Petra on 79th every Sunday. When he's doing it, it seems like he don't care, but inside he does. I feel supported at school where they help us learn. School is a place that keeps us out of trouble. I feel supported through sports. Right now I play on the football team at Rainbow Beach. I play basketball everywhere I can find. Rainbow Beach or a park by my auntie's house. There's always people up there playing together, even at places like stores. I feel supported. Every time I go in one of those stores, like Dollar General, if I ask them where to find something, they help and get it for us. In this community, you learn stuff. You go through obstacles to live. We learn from the heartbreak. I know that I'm going to live with this community until I grow up. Then I will have learned all the lessons that I should have learned. So I will move away to go to college to learn new lessons there. For now, though, my most important life is being a big brother to 6 younger brothers and sisters. When my first brother was born 6 years ago, my life changed. It helped me every time I see him. It makes me get a feeling. I want to teach him stuff and remember stuff that I told him. Even the stuff that I don't expect him to remember, he does. He's like a mini version of me. I want him to be just like me. Both of my little brothers are just like me. I always wanted somebody to reflect on me. I want them to follow me too. Hopefully I go to college and want them to act on what I do. I want him to grow up in this neighborhood too. If he grows up in this place, he's going to learn the lessons that I'm learning. I want us to grow up in this type of neighborhood, get grown, move out, and come back to visit.
Thank you all.
We cited news trucks and cameras here, and we read your article, 6 shot in South Shore Laundromat and another man shooting in Tarrytown.
We saw the news reporters with fancy suits in front of our laundromat.
You spent 24 hours here, but you really don't know us.
Those who don't know us think this is a poor neighborhood with those abandoned buildings with the wood cover on the windows and broken doors. Those who don't know us saw the police on the corner and think that we're all violence and drugs. They see the candy wrappers and empty juice bottles and think we don't care.
Uneducated, jobless thieves, you'll be scared of these heartless people.
When you see us coming, you might hurry up and run to your cars and lock the doors.
Then speed down these streets at 60 miles per hour like you're on the highway, trying to get out of this ghetto.
We want you to know us. We aren't afraid. We know that man at the corner. He works at the store and gives us free lemon heads.
Those girls jumping rope are Precious, Anaya, and Nivea.
The people in Sus are not going to Finners but to church.
That little creepy dog is Cyanus, Lamar's dog.
We are the kids who find crates so we can shoot hoops.
When the sun shines here, it's not God saying he wants to burn us, but he sees us all with bright futures. Those who know us look at the ones who want to go to college, not the ones who dropped out.
If you listen, you'll hear the laughter and chatter from the group of girls on the corner who are best friends and really care about each other. Do you see the smile on the cashier's face when the kids walk in? Why? Because this neighborhood is filled with love. This isn't Chirac. This is home. This is us.
The voices of young adults and neighbors in neighborhoods. The theme of the second morning panel is Envisioning Smart Neighborhoods, Old School, New School, or No School. The panelists include Herman Brewer, the Bureau Chief for Economic Development of Cook County, who has enjoyed a long career at MacArthur, the Urban League, Chicago LISC, and elsewhere. Bernita Johnson-Gabriel, the Executive Director of Quad Communities Development, which is a not-for-profit focused on economic development, education, and employment in the South Lakefront area of the county. Terry Mazzani, the President and CEO of the Chicago Community Trust, who also performed double duty for a year as the Superintendent of Chicago Public Schools. And Isaiah Thomas, CEO and founder of Isaiah International, a native Chicagoan who spent many years with that basketball team over to the east, the Detroit Pistons. The moderator for the panel is Richard Steele of WBEZ, whose Vocalo's Barbershop Show can be heard on the radio at 91.5, and who also contributes to WBEZ's morning shift, afternoon shift, worldview, and special programming. Welcome.
Is it my turn to speak? Okay. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to have a really good discussion today with some very knowledgeable people as we talk about neighborhood as an urban strategy. How we're going to start this off is that each of these individuals is going to give us 3 to 5 minutes, just an overview of kind of where they're coming from, and then we'll open it up for a discussion in different areas that we're going to talk about today that you can connect with very easily. So first, Isaiah Thomas, again, CEO and founder of Isaiah International, LLC, former NBA star, Detroit Pistons. Isn't that team that we beat? Oh, no. I promise not to say that. I promise not to go there.
After
but
several tries. Could you say that again? After several tries.
Oh, right. Okay, I forgot about that part. So, Isaiah, why don't we hear from you first in terms of, as we talk about this neighborhood as an urban strategy. We had a very interesting discussion a few minutes ago with these young boys who were up here. And Isaiah asked them some very pointed questions about neighborhood, and that rapport was there. It's interesting how you connect with youngsters after they got beyond the Isaiah Thomas. It was just a great conversation.
Well, thank you. And, you know, when we talk about neighborhood, the first question that I asked was, you know, what really makes up a neighborhood? Because there may be some debate about, you know, what really is a neighborhood. And the interesting answer that I got from the kids was that it really is about the people in the community, who you talk to, who you live with, who you socialize with. And I'll speak from my personal experience on the panel about what a neighborhood meant to me living in poverty. I was one of those kids who grew up on the west side of Chicago here. We probably wasn't counted in the Census Bureau. I grew up below the poverty line, so my experiences with poverty in the community that I grew up in It was a community of people that were dedicated to us being educated. Education was the #1 priority in the community. And the opportunity gaps that we saw in the educational system, as those slowly closed, sports and recreation opened up other opportunity gaps within the community. And we just saw the Jackie Robinson West team that brought Chicago together through sport. But when you think about the experience that those kids got and received from traveling outside of that 4-block radius that you are restricted by in some of your communities that are afflicted with poverty, you get a chance to travel to different cities, you get a chance to meet different people who are speaking different languages, have different cultural experiences, and it allows you to dream and have bigger visions. So those are some of the things that I'll be talking about today.
Thank you, Isaiah. Bernita Johnson Gabriel, your experience with a large number of school closings in Chicago, and as you and I talked about 20 minutes before we even came in here, and it had to do with, you talked a lot about, it's more than just about 50 schools closing. The picture is larger than that, and discussion should be larger than that. So kind of what you'll be talking about today.
Good morning. Thank you. Good morning. Yes, we did have a chance to chat a little bit about the situation with schools in our communities, and I'll be sharing some points later on in the discussion, but I have a really, really great job. I get to look at all of the quality of life issues in the community, sort of like a puzzle, pieces of a puzzle, and I get to work on putting that puzzle together in the communities of North Kenwood, Oakland, Douglas, and Grand Boulevard. And if you kind of look at it geographically, we're bookended between the South Loop and Hyde Park, from the lakefront to the Dam Ryan. Most of you in the audience probably know, if you're from Chicago, the area was heavily populated at one time by a large number of public housing residents, and is now being revitalized and reorganized as a mixed income community, and that's something that's very dear to us, something that we're trying to hold on to. So as we look at the pieces of the puzzle of what makes a healthy, vibrant community, you're looking at all kinds of things. You're looking at commercial retail, you're looking at amenities, you're looking at arts and culture, the rich history of our community. And one of the things that we're looking at very closely are the quality of our schools. And so while Richard and I were talking this morning earlier about the number of schools that closed and the effect that it's had on communities, and in my communities, there were 6 that closed. You still have to look a little bit further and a little bit deeper. One, what was the quality of those schools to begin with? And 2, how can we move the conversation from what happened to how we're going to improve the quality of the schools that remain? So I hope that we get to have a really nice conversation about that today.
And by the way, as a kid, I was in Grand Boulevard. I went to Douglas at 32nd and Calumet a long time ago. All right. Herman Brewer, there's certainly, most certainly a suburban component to the urban strategy. Cook County, definitely a stakeholder. And you and I had a nice conversation a few minutes ago about Cook County and the south suburbs. And part of the discussion that has been taking place recently was a lot about the movement of people from the south side of Chicago when some of the public housing buildings closed, and the influx of people and how that sort of changed the dynamic and some of the issues that are concerns of that particular part of our locale. So you might want to talk about that for a minute.
Well, thank you, Richard. I'm obviously grateful to be here and be a part of this panel. And there's so many folks here who I know as colleagues and very creative strategists around some of the issues that are being discussed. You've heard from one of my bosses earlier, Bridget Gaynor. And yeah, Richard survived me bending his ear for probably more than 20 minutes. I'm so glad you could stand it. But certainly the suburban dynamic around education is broader and more dire in some respects than just talking about what's occurring in South Cook. There are things happening across borders all over the county, whether it's northwest, west, and south. And I sort of, and I'll talk about it more later, I know that we tend to hear more about and debate more about in the media and the like about the large issue, which was centered around CPS because it's hundreds of thousands of kids. But I like to think that we've got some mini pockets, mini M-I-N-I pockets of disparity in our suburban communities. And some of the drama around schools funding, and the impact on local properties and property taxes, growth, development, and sustainability, it's at a fever pitch. It is a very, very difficult situation that's impacting a lot of what people plan and try to do in suburban Cook County. So I've been very fortunate not only, again, to be a part of this panel, but to also be a part of a host of strategies that we've tried to do or to implement to assist in not only thinking but implementing and carrying out some changes.
Terry Mazzini, part of the larger picture here is the idea of trying to bring kind of disparate forces together to try to create a better environment in the overall. How would you describe the state of urban neighborhoods at this point in time? What are we looking at today? What's the real deal? I mean, I know that the fund is looking at the broader picture in terms of what needs to be done and what the problems are from your perspective.
The Chicago Community Trust is in a significant role looking broadly at the six-county region. We recognize both urban issues and the suburban issues. We are convinced that we need to act as a region in terms of the global stage, that is where economically we are competitive, and that our success on the global stage then is translated into prosperity at the local level. Our grant making covers a broad range of issues, from basic human needs and securing the safety net to health care and health access. We've played a prominent role with the Affordable Care Act enrollment, and Cook County has done an amazing job of bringing in more than 100,000 people who didn't have access to insurance before the Affordable Care Act. So this is real quality of life improvement, represents income into our neighborhoods and communities. It's part of the economic vitality of our region. For that, housing is central to this, affordable housing, resources to end homelessness, and education is, I think, still the bedrock of all of this, the opportunity structure that people have, and a commitment to sustainable development and the environment as we look at the increasing challenges from climate change and a degrading environment that we have to live in. It gives us the ability to look at all of these features together and have access to a lot of different data. One of the interesting data sets that we look at is the city's own hardship index that combines measures of poverty, unemployment, education attainment, household formation. And if you go back to the 2000 census, Chicago's 77 neighborhoods were pretty evenly split, 50-50, prospering neighborhoods about 38, and declining neighborhoods about 39. Fast forward to the 2010 census with the impact of the Great Recession, and there is a marked compression of neighborhoods in Chicago that are still prosperous. We're down to 21 neighborhoods that are feeling any sort of positive economic activity, household formation, and education attainment there, which creates a scenario, as Commissioner Gaynor talked about, where we have to have a strategy for how to deal with urban change with shifting and declining populations, so that we don't degrade the overall values for the communities and end up past a tipping point that would take us on the path to a Detroit or a Cleveland.
So the old saying that rising tide raises all boats, not necessarily.
No, we're not experiencing it. It's a bifurcated economy. The keys for success and opportunity here are not felt from the ground up. And I'll go a step further. I want to pick up on what Philip Blackwell talked about, as I think one of the responsibilities that the Chicago Community Trust has, and us on the panel, is to open a larger moral vocabulary about these issues, to talk about issues of fairness, justice, and equity, and to make that part of our civic dialogue and debate. If we look at the city plan for the city of Portland, for instance, the organizing principle for that plan is equity. If that is your guiding principle for how resources are distributed, how investments are made, where care and compassion is experienced, it changes a lot of the experiences at the neighborhood level, the supports that the young men that we just saw up here, that they would experience growing up to have the opportunities equitably distributed in their life.
And to expand on that, we're going to open this up. This is conversation now. And to expand on that point about the equity aspect of it, who decides that? Where are those decisions made about the equity aspect of it? It's probably in the words of Mike Royko, it's like, who gets what, right? And who decides that? Yes, you brought it up, so I want to put it back to you.
Yeah.
I mean, equity, as you point out, it's an essential part of this whole idea about moving forward on this and bringing some parity, right?
Yeah. So it's a matter of leadership, and leadership is expressed at all levels in our community, and there it's this commitment for the benefit of all, for a common good. And the notion of common good is being pushed to the margins, but it's the essential heart of a neighborhood, of residents working together for their common good. And so we have a responsibility, you have a responsibility at WBEZ, the county has a responsibility, Bernita has a responsibility in championing this for her organization. Investors have a responsibility for look at how they can not only create a return for their shareholders, but how they can do good at the community level. Our city leadership, our state leadership, all share in this, our religious leadership as well. Earlier in the spring, we hosted On the Table, 11,000 voices coming together in a large public square on a single day. We heard resoundingly, people said, it's about education because that's the key to opportunity. It's about civic engagement of people actively doing what they can to make their communities better. And it's about collaboration. As I've said over and over again, if you can do it by yourself, it probably isn't worth doing, because the problems we face today require all of us working together.
I'm talking about civic engagement and involvement. You mentioned Detroit a minute ago, and I don't know how many people saw this morning, but on MSNBC, on Morning Joe, the show was done from Detroit today, and talking about some of these same elements we're talking about now in terms of bringing Detroit back. It was a very interesting show, and a lot of interesting information about how you make this happen. Isaiah, one of the things that I wanted to bring to you was about that aspect of civic involvement. You mentioned a minute ago about the Jackie Robinson Little League team. So I want to start this discussion at the base level, which is where people are. One of the things that happened with the Jackie Robinson West Little League team is that there were people who, the parents and grandparents, those were people involved in that process, that volunteered to help at the stadium, to clean it up, to volunteer with the kids, to be there for them, to bring them to practice, to show up at games. So let's talk a little bit about that from your perspective, that base, which is people who live there.
Well, it starts with, you know, it's a philosophy versus data question in terms of the philosophy of the community. And when we talk about love, compassion, caring, engaging with one another, caring for your neighbor, that's not a data issue. That's not something that data really takes account of. But this is where we really need to start from. And this is where sport and play is so crucial to all communities, because sport and play brings together people where they can interact and you can love your neighbor, you can communicate with your neighbor, you can get to know your neighbor, you can get to know people. And once you get to know people, and Father Pfleger and I are, we have our third annual Peace Game coming up Saturday here in Chicago. Well, we brought rival gang members together and asked them would they play a game for peace, just for one day. And this started 3 years ago, and they said yes. Now, the first peace game, we had to individually bus the members, the gang members in from their different communities. We had to bus them to St. Sabina, play, so forth and so on. Once they started playing and they got to know each other, and after the game we went downstairs and we started talking, and I vividly remember this. The guy said to one of the others, said, you know, you were shooting at me last week.
Not with a basketball, right?
Yeah, he said, you were shooting at me, you know, but you know, you all right.
Right.
You know, you're not bad. But what happens in all communities when you start economically disinvesting in our communities? The first thing we do is we take sport and play and recreation out of the community. And when you take sport and play out of the community, you start creating territorial barriers. So the only place that kids really have a chance to get to know each other is really at school. And consequently, when you're at school, you don't really get a chance to socialize the way you would get a chance to socialize and interact outside of school. So now when you leave school, there's really no place for you to go, there's nothing for you to do, and there's no place or nobody for you to interact with, because we've closed the park districts down. There's no baseball teams, there's no basketball teams, there's no football teams. There's no place for you to interact. Now, when I was growing up here on the west side of Chicago, and I was growing up in extreme poverty. And when I say extreme poverty, I mean extreme poverty. This was before they initiated, the Black Panthers initiated the free breakfast program, or free lunch program. So there was no food, no
breakfast.
No breakfast, nothing.
All right.
So I was growing up in that community, but growing up in poverty, what I did have access to, I had access to a fully operating park district that had a swim team, that had a baseball team, that had a basketball team, that had a football team. I had a church in a community that was dedicated and committed to one thing, and that was education. Everyone in our community spoke about one thing, and that was being educated. Educated was the pathway out. We were on welfare. My mother would take her welfare check and buy us books. She would sacrifice food for books. So that was the commitment of the community. And consequently, out of that community, we had people come out. There were doctors, lawyers, policemen. My brother may be in the audience today. He's a retired policeman. My sister may be in the audience today.
She's a teacher.
Been teaching 30 years at Taft. So she teaches Spanish. And so, you know, our community, it was a very mixed community, because poor does not discriminate. Poverty does not discriminate. Whether you black, white, if you don't have enough money, you down here with us.
Without question.
We all in the
same thing, right?
But what the community needs to provide for you in poverty is a fully operating, functional school, park district, church. And the church has to be a place where The church goes out into the community, not the community comes to the church. Father Pfleger, when you talk about Father Pfleger, he's knocking on people's doors. Hey, Miss Johnson, how you doing? How's your son? So forth and so. Miss Johnson don't have to come to church. So the community is engaged. The community is active. And even though people aren't eating, even though people didn't have the finest of clothes, you can educate in poverty if the community is engaged and committed. Now, I'll finish with just one more thing. At 13 years old, you take away my ability to play. You take away food for me to eat because we have food deserts in our community. And you filled me up with only bad food that I can eat. And I can't play. And when I go to school, I'm in a classroom with 40 or 50 people in the classroom, but we only have 25 books. And the people in the classroom aren't seriously engaged, and the teachers aren't seriously engaged. Now, I have nothing or no place to really get that energy out. So when I leave school and I come home and there's no food in the refrigerator, and there's no clothes for me to wear, and the shame and the pain and the embarrassment that I feel every single day, then you know what? I am really, really angry. So when you look at all these young people walking around and you say, oh, he's a gangbanger, and he gets labeled for being a gangbanger. Every time there's a shooting in Chicago right now, the first thing that the media say is gang-related. Well, wait a minute, time out. How do you know? Did you talk to somebody? Are you telling me that 16-year-old girl was in a gang? You telling me that 17-year-old boy is in a gang? How do you know? But we read gang-related. Consequently, we see fear. So when you give kids a chance to play in the environment, I stop looking at you in a fearful way, whether you black or white. I start looking at you as a person to play with, not a person to fear.
And evidently, there is life after the NBA. Mother can speak. You know what I mean?
Well,
Terry, you get a chance to.
Again, education.
Right.
I graduated from Indiana, and I went back to UC Berkeley to get my master's in education. Not because of me, but because my mother instilled that in me.
You talked about education a lot. I want to transition to it. By the way, this conversation is open to everybody who wants to chime in at any point. But I do want to talk to you, Benita, because we talked a lot about schools and education, and Isaiah brought that to the table. And so I think this is a good point to talk about the schools, and part of the discussion you and I had was about the whole concept and idea of a neighborhood school. We're talking about neighborhoods here. Now, today, and you guys correct me if I'm wrong about this, but it's become a fact that the neighborhood school simply means it's a building that's in that neighborhood, as opposed necessarily to, the community that functions around that school with kids and parents who live around there being involved in that, in school activities and whatever else takes place. But you can explain better than I can.
Right. As we were talking today, we talked about a number of things as it relates to neighborhood schools, as it relates to community schools, and what the levels of excellence these schools have. So for those of you not familiar with the CPS ranking system, a level 1 school is an exceedingly performing school. A level 2 school performs at a moderate rate, so they are performing. And then a level 3 school is a non-performing school, which many times are on probation. And we had 6 schools closed within my community. 3 of them were level 3 and had been on probation 5, 7, and 11 years, respectively. So it gives you a sense of what communities are dealing with, particularly communities of need. When we talk about neighborhood, the center of a neighborhood, or a lot of people think that that's what the schools are, but in reality, that is not what they are. We have I don't even think in our community we have one community school. A community school means it's open after hours so that there's programming for kids. It's open early so there's programming for kids. There are resources and services within that building where folks from the community can come in and access, parents, residents, whatever it is they need. That is not happening in all neighborhoods.
And by the way, let me just say, in that description of what community neighborhood schools are, schools that function that way have activities not only for kids, but they're learning activities for parents and other people in the neighborhood. There may be some health situations that they're able to deal with. They serve a lot of functions if they truly are community neighborhood schools. That was the tradition. That doesn't exist to a large degree.
For example, there could be a community partner within that school that is providing help for parents who are looking for employment. There could be folks within that sphere that are helping folks who are having home problems or being evicted or whatever. So all of these things help to make up that community school, and that's where everybody could go for assistance. And that is not happening everywhere. In terms of neighborhood schools, they are defined by the attendance boundary. So if you live in a particular area, that is the school that you are to go to. And I'll share some statistics with you. I have to put my glasses on so I can see them. But there are statistics that the majority of our neighborhood schools are level 3 schools. So if we have some stellar level 2 schools. In some communities or some neighborhoods within my community, there are no level 1 schools. And the level 2 schools are either charter or magnet or specialty, which means your children have to test to get in. They don't automatically go. So this kind of thing poses challenges for when you're trying to rebuild community and to ensure that everyone is on the same or a level playing field, and it's just not happening.
And by the way, one of the things that we do want to kind of talk about, Terry, at some point is, and all of you, is how do we come to some kind of parity with these situations? What's the approach? I know the fund looks at lots of possible alternatives and solutions, but at the end of the day, we want to kind of take a look at what can help relieve that situation, but continue.
And the one thing I want to say, piggybacking on what Isaiah said about that, how you're feeling upset and angry when you see all of these things around you. There are all these broken pieces that you see around you, and you do get upset. Now, I'm not from Chicago. I grew up in North Carolina, and I went to high school 1,000 years ago. But one of the things that really gets me about Chicago is all this specialty stuff. Yes. Because we had high schools that you went to based on where you lived, and the coursework within that building was based on your ability. So if you tested to get into honors classes, those are the classes you took. If you tested, and we had levels too, 1, 2, and 3, you were in those levels. And then with the special ed folks, we were all in the same building.
Was in that same school?
All in the same school, all eating lunch together, all having sports together, all doing everything together. And we never saw the difference. We never saw it. Now, fast forward to Chicago today, I'm this kid that Isaiah's talking about, and I got to walk past a selective enrollment school because I can't get into it. And I feel like crap because I got to go to that school that everybody knows is a failing school. How does that make me feel growing up? I'm just not, my esteem is just,
on the floor.
It's just impossible. When I listen to my friends when I first came here, and they were going through all this stress about testing to get in, and they were talking about kindergarten. I'm like, what are you talking about? Oh my God, we got to test them if they don't get in, and if she gets in, then Assembly can get in. I'm like, this is crazy. But the whole thing, and you know what, I got to preface this by saying I'm speaking as Bernita, not QCDC, because my board chair is probably out there, pulling her hair out. But when I see these kinds of things, it fuels the anger and the stress that some of these kids are experiencing. And we're walking around wondering why they're upset. And you would be upset too.
Well, some of the great philosophers warned us of this type of society, a society that's basically built around data decision making, devoid of compassion, care, and love. And where we are today is we are slowly becoming a society that is data-driven decision making, devoid of love, compassion, and care. And I would submit that we put love, compassion, and care back into the mix of data research.
And I just wonder, you know, Herman Brewer, I wonder what's the reality about that? I mean, you have to have a basis from which to work. That is to determine how many haves and have-nots are there, what do the have-nots need? So there's got to be some kind of measuring situation to get to where you want to go, right?
Yeah, you've got to have a platform. You've got to have a foundation from which you make decisions on. But you started out earlier saying, who makes the decisions?
Correct.
Who's driving this? And what we've heard very poignantly articulated here is the sort of the outcomes of over-design. Okay, we've got over-designed specialties relative to schools, and we've lost sight of the fundamentals, that the role that a school plays in a community, as a community center, as a gathering place, as a place where everyone can go. Now we've got, again, as we said, all these specialties. One of the outcomes of that is we now have not only stressed children in esteem issues, but we've got parents who are losing their mind. I mean, when you talk about, trying to test to get into kindergarten, I was talking to one of my neighbors and I kept saying, geez, I'm glad my kids are grown, because I don't know if I could go through that again. I remembered. So there are very, very emotional decisions and difficult decisions and challenges that parents have trying to maneuver to have their kids in the right schools. There may be no more emotional decision that a parent makes than where their child goes to school, what kind of education their child gets, no matter what their economic strata. And we're seeing that, there's this, the things that Bernita just talked about, there's this sort of calculus that parents have to, overcome, if you will, to get their kids into a school where they can feel comfortable, they're going to get an education, they're going to be safe, they're going to be cared for, and they can go to work and not be worried all day.
It's almost like making a decision about college.
Yeah.
It becomes that serious at this point.
Yeah, it's way more, exactly. But along with that, this over-design and these challenges have created the barriers that Isaiah was talking about.
Tell me about that from the perspective of the look at the suburbs in Cook County.
Yeah, because I don't want my comments to be perceived as, beating up on CPS specifically. People are trying to solve problems, and it's led to some of the over-design I mentioned. In the suburbs, you've got this, as I said, these many pockets of disparity, and we have emerging rapidly a sort of have and have not list of communities. There are 122 municipalities in Cook County, if you will, and the disparity statistically between the higher performing school districts and the lower performing school districts, it's just dramatic. And what that's doing, if you think again back to the fundamentals, parents, whether they're in Chicago, whether they're anywhere in the U.S., parents shop school districts. We're going to live where there's a good school. That's what parents do. But here in Northern Illinois, that has become an even more acute decision. It's around not only the price of the home and the quality of the school, but it plays into what's my property tax bill going to be. My property tax bill is dramatically tied to the condition and quality of that school. And it's an odd, juxtaposition of things. Because we have people living in communities, I'll just give you a couple examples, real quick. Don't crush you on this, but we have people living in homes that are valued at maybe $50,000, who may have a tax bill that's $7,000 or $8,000 or $9,000. Okay. If you dig deeper, you'll find that home is probably in a community that has a low-performing K through 8 school district. And if you look at that K through 8 school district's impact on that property tax bill, in most cases, 90% of the cases, it is dramatic. There's a district, I won't call it out, okay, there's a district that I've looked at very closely, where there are 300 kids in this K through 8 school district. It spans 2 communities. They have a 10-to-1 student-teacher ratio. That seems pretty good. But I have a global corporate business interest that has a location in that district, and they refuse to expand. They're just waiting for their lease to run out so they can get out of there, because they pay $750,000 a year in property taxes just to that one school district. And that school district has the second lowest standardized scores in the state. Now, how is that?
Yeah, how is that?
You know, but that's the school funding formula, and the school funding formula creates these incredible disparities because people flee these communities. Businesses, industry. If I could flip that around, that employer would expand and there would be 150 new jobs on that site. But it's not going to happen as long as that formula is as it is. So when they leave, that residential, that homeowner, their tax bill is going to go up that much more just so they can fill that gap.
Sure.
So that's what's going on in the suburbs. It's dramatically affecting the funds available to schools. And so the disparity, they can just be blocks away. You can have a healthy district over here because there's a shopping mall and there's all these commercial interests that are paying taxes. And you can have a district over here that is solely reliant on residential property taxes. And their kids are not getting a quality education. And they're paying dearly. And it is a very, very intense emotional situation that has emerged. It's been going on for a while, but it's continued to get bad. And it's difficult to draw attention to it because there are many pockets. And we've got to deal with these other issues. We have in those communities the same kinds of barriers developing, the same sort of drop-off in resources. You know, folks my age and other folks complain about rap music and hip-hop culture and those sorts of things, the lesser parts of it. And you have to think about it. When we cut budgets, we take music and the arts out of school.
Yeah, that was the other thing I was going to mention, Isaiah. You know, along with the sports and the things that are available along those lines, music was the other thing that took the hit.
Yeah, we took music and art out of schools. What the kids do? They
Which
start making their own
kids. Right, exactly. So, Terry Mazzani, you know, we've talked about a lot of things here, and part of what the trust is interested in, all those things, whether it's infrastructure, schools, transportation, safety, those are all major issues, and they're all things that have to be addressed when we're talking about schools in the urban area, about neighborhoods in the urban area, and connecting the dots so that we can make these things work better. And I don't know exactly, but I know I think I did read this, Community Trust is exploring what it will take to strengthen the city's neighborhoods with a research project called Chicago Neighborhoods 2014, Assets, Past Plans and Trends. Can you talk about that for a minute?
Your question goes to the point of the value of plans. Susanna talked about that in her opening remarks there. To me, the plan contains the vision that leadership has for their community, and I look at plans as a moral document that describe the move of resources around a community or to address a set of problems for that. At the neighborhood level, we've got an experience, thanks to MacArthur Foundation funding and LISC leadership, these quality of life plans in a number of neighborhoods that have served well to galvanize and create coherence in how a neighborhood moves forward. Widen that out, though, as we've talked about in the earlier panel, there are these larger macro forces that are at play driving populations either out of communities, into communities, the flow of resources away. The school closing as an example, taking a vital anchor institution, community asset out of a community. And so the city has become very interested in reestablishing a set of plans that can help make these allocation decisions for a new Chicago. Chicago has a history of reinventing itself. I think it, more than most cities, is poised to know how to do that. One of our interests is that at the core of this reinvention is that principle of equity, that all benefit. And so we're looking at 16 plans across the city now that look at broader than a neighborhood, but the influences around an individual neighborhood that help to give a logic for where investments are made. Understand that for a neighborhood, for a family, for a kid, the most important school choice that they want is to walk across the street to their neighborhood school. We have created a tension between school excellence and neighborhood schools that doesn't need to be there. We've got this history now over a couple of decades long of a brain drain out of a neighborhood, that the best and brightest, based on standardized test scores, go out to these selective enrollment schools. Kids with a passion and aptitude for a particular specialty go to a magnet school. Kids where the parents have a sense of capital and efficacy go to charter schools, and what's left is the shabby little neighborhood school that nobody feels good about going to, and creates this psychological impact. Very different is a strategy and plan that invests in these neighborhood schools, recognize that it's more than the education. It is that place that individuals, children, families can go to receive a lot of supports before school, during school, after school, on weekends. They're connected with the Park District programs. They're connected with the youth centers. They're connected with the libraries so that everybody has broadband access, as Brian talked about earlier. It's that sort of reinvestment in communities at a macro level that I think these plans will help to structure so that leaders at the neighborhood level can count on aligned resource investment.
But don't you have to address the issue of, say, the lack of academic achievement in a given school, where the numbers are terrible, and you look at that. I mean, that's kind of how a lot of this came about. That the neighborhood school, a lot of neighborhood schools were underperforming.
But you know what, let me say that I really, not to interrupt, but it's sort of
Sure,
like,
you can interrupt.
think about, well, because Terry's always on a roll, and I never want to stop him, but you think about anything else that you treat. If you're in the medical profession or something, if something's atrophying,
sure.
If the school's not performing, there's an atrophy. Do you abandon treatment? Do you walk away from it? Do you go and put those resources towards what's strengthened or healthy? And that seems to me to be what seems to be occurring. It's like we sort of give up on an atrophied situation. And so that's what I'm disturbed about.
I think everything that we're all talking about is accurate, but I think we're dancing around an issue of poverty and segregation that we, as a panel, we should address. Because I think we're dancing around that issue, and as I look out at the audience, it appears that they would want us to talk about that issue a little bit.
Well, look, the other issue about talking about schools in Chicago, I mean, the reality is in the public school system, black and brown kids make up, what, 85%? There's about 15% of the, is that?
About 90.
Yeah, about 90%. Only about 10, 15% of the school population in Chicago is white. And so
so again, I think we're living in a time now where schools are more segregated than ever. And when you talk about the distribution of wealth in this country and the inequities that poor and underprivileged kids have to deal with in terms of having access to resources, I mean, these are big questions. And this isn't, I don't think this is something that any of us here take lightly, but, you know, when we talk about education, you know, it's like when we talk about love. Well, people look at love in a lot of different ways. And when we talk about education, you touched on what is being taught in the schools. You know, what are the kids receiving? What's being taught at home? Education used to be a community thing, not just a school thing. And you learned more at home than you did at school. I was taught at home. I wasn't taught this in school, that Christopher Columbus didn't discover America. But in school, I was taught Christopher Columbus discovered America. But when I got home,
That's the truth.
I was told that's not true. There's another book for you to read. Okay, so when you talk about libraries, I mean, they take libraries out of these communities, and we talk about who really has access now to real education. And poor people, people who are living in poverty right now, they don't have access to real education. They don't have access to the same private school education that you're getting in some suburban communities. So when we talk about education, why is philosophy taught in the suburbs but not taught in the public schools anymore? I mean, we're talking about the same thing, critical thinking. I mean, so those type of things, I do think we need to have an honest and open discussion about what is really going on in this country and why.
And it's segregation, but it's also, as you said, economics and poverty. Because a lot of the things that you talked about, a lot of the things that we talk about, we're talking about people who have the wherewithal to navigate the system and get their kids into a better educational situation. The majority don't have that. They don't have a way to navigate the system, and their kids are the ones. There are probably tons of kids in low-performing schools that have no business being there. They have no business being there. But because there's nobody to advocate, there's nobody to navigate, there's nobody to get them to where they need to be so they can be the best that they can be, they're not going to be there. But then you got to flip it and look at it from the other side. Why should you have to do all that to get a quality education for your kid?
Yeah.
Why is that?
Instead of just walk across the street,
Walk across
go
the
to your
street,
neighborhood
go
school.
and learn. And if we have struggling schools, and we know we do, hi Mary, we have struggling schools, those are the schools where you pile in those resources.
That's what I'm saying.
That's where the investment needs to be made. That's where all those supports come in, because guess what? Those parents need support.
Is testing a true indication of knowledge in education?
No, testing is testing.
Well, standardized testing doesn't necessarily work for all students. I mean, I think it depends on what your, the beginnings of your education are, and if you are in a system that is somewhat deficient, it doesn't mean that when you test, you're not a smart person.
Well, Isaiah, your free throw percentage isn't going to say you're going to be a star.
Exactly.
Your vertical leap isn't going to say you're going to be a star. I mean, that's sort of what I look at. I don't know, Terry, do we test for critical thinking? I mean,
And I think, the point is made, there's a lot of frustration among educators and academics around the overemphasis on testing and applying a narrow measure of student ability and achievement to a broader set of decisions about where the child can go, how the teacher is evaluated, how a principal is assessed, how a school is ranked. There are a number of high-stakes decisions that are made based upon a fairly narrow spectrum of student performance.
When we were growing up, we were, and I'm sure, I don't know if your parents talked to you about the system, but I know in our household, we heard the system daily. And, you know, and some of you are laughing in the audience because it was the system, the man, the system. But what we were learning is how to navigate and understand the system that we are living in and under here in America. How do you navigate the system? And we talk about the system and testing and everything else, but you know, as the levers move up and down on the system, there was community activity, community engagement, and community information being talked about and dispensed about what's happening in the system. The educational system, the health system, the economic system, so forth and so on. Nowadays, system is, I don't know what that word means anymore. I know when we heard system, you know, our ears kind of went up like, okay, we gotta listen to this. When we talk about systems now, they mean different things. So I just think, again, we need, data is one way of including, and it's one way of excluding. And there needs to be compassion and care and love brought back to the conversation.
Well, let me pick up, you put race out there. And I think it's generally given lip service that Chicago's the most segregated city in the
Now, race
country.
is an interesting concept, by the way.
Yeah.
You know, I had a professor at Cal by the name of Professor Omi who, you know, race is, you know, if we're talking about race and classifications and stereotypes that go along in the constructed box of race, then, you know, sometimes you don't want to be in the race that you've been assigned to. So race is an interesting concept. I'll just put that out there.
And so I was in the Oakland schools about the time that you were perhaps there. And so it's the part of that, and I think Ta-Nehisi Coates did a magnificent job in the Atlantic article.
Everybody read that Atlantic article?
The reparations. And, you know, the other part of the conversation has to be about white privilege in individuals like myself, recognizing that there is another component. Race is not about African Americans. It's not ethnic issues with Latinos. It's not about skin color, exclusively about those with greater pigment, but it's also about the assumed white privilege. And so when you asked about my schools, I didn't have to grow up in a context of knowing how to work the system. It was a given that the system would work for me, and that I didn't even have to give a second thought about having a pathway. Even I was not dirt poor, but we were definitely low income, and I had economic challenges to overcome. But I didn't have issues of race to overcome, and that gave me a greater degree of error, that as a young person I could make some mistakes and it wouldn't carry with me the rest of my life for that. People would look the other way if I wasn't behaving in a certain way. And so I got a lot of free passes along the road for that. And I think this is, in my view, definitely a part of the conversation about what do we need to do to get back to equitable opportunities for all of our young people.
Well,
we look at Officer Friendly. Remember Officer Friendly?
Yeah.
You had Officer Friendly. We grew up with Officer Friendly.
Yeah, we grew up with
Officer Friendly's not in there anymore.
We knew the police officer who would tell us, boy, don't be on this corner when I come back. You know what I mean?
And he knew your parents.
And he knew our parents, and so it was that kind of thing. But you were talking about in terms of navigating the system, and that's a good point, because we were told this is what you got to do because this is how it works. And today you're right. The system is still there, but in terms of navigating the system, it's a whole different mindset.
We were told.
Well, let me just say this one first.
Daily. Don't believe everything you read, and don't believe everything you see on television.
Let me just say this to address that from a comedy standpoint, and you'll remember this, that Dick Gregory said. He said that being born white in America is like being born with a $10 bill in your pocket to say it's a leg up. But the other part of that is it's not an excuse to not make it, because as you pointed out, our parents told us how to navigate the system, so that even with those things in place that were negatives as an African American or Hispanic, this is kind of what you do to make a move.
And what I mean by, when you're poor and in poverty, again, poverty and being poor does not discriminate. You're down there with black, white, Hispanics. I mean, I had Mexican friends, Spanish friends, Puerto Rican friends. We were all together. So everyone was talking about how to navigate the system. Now, inherently, there was some white privilege in terms of job opportunity, police, and so forth and so on. But at the same time, you understood like how to navigate and how to move. Right now, I think that all kids, from an educational standpoint, they're not getting access to the right and proper information. And I believe this wholeheartedly. If we give all kids access and we give them the right information, the correct information, real hardcore information, I am positive that most of all kids who are living in poverty will make the right decisions. But right now, the misinformation that they're being fed and the inability to navigate what's coming to them and what they're seeing and actually what they're experiencing. Those 3 kids that were up here before us, the way they were talking, I'm sure probably surprised a lot of you. Because one of the things that they were saying is, hey, our community is not that bad. What we see on a daily basis is not what we're reading in the newspaper. And the only time the media and everyone shows up is when somebody gets killed. Well, that doesn't happen every day. But
life goes on. There are other things that are happening.
Yeah.
Let me ask you this.
I
Go
wanted
ahead.
to say one thing, and to just follow up with you on that. Also, what we're not talking about is with our young people is expectations. And expectations, where you set the expectation is where they will rise to. And you can go into some of these level 3 classrooms and you see where the expectation bar is, and it's way down here. It's way down here. So I just wanted to throw out that among things that we need to talk about is setting the expectation for our kids.
Terry, one of the things that I think is important to the trust, from what I understand, is that this idea of trying to bring the forces together that are interested in these kinds of changes, because each of the groups represented that are trying to make changes usually go about it in different ways. It's kind of like everybody's got a guy. If I go to this guy, I know an elected official who can get this done. Somebody else knows somebody who's in a powerful position at a corporation. He can get that done, so I'm going to go this way. And so everybody's kind of looking for their guy to get it done, as opposed to trying to, to get the forces together, determine what the problems are, and try to find some unified direction in terms of doing what's got to be done. Am I correct about that in terms of the community fund trying to sort of corral all of that?
In every area that we provide funding, there's generally a collaborative approach to that. We look at the issue of childhood obesity. There's a 900 organization collaborative called the Consortium to Lower Obesity in Chicago's Children that comes together around that, for that. In terms of community development spanning the county, there's the Millennium Reserve effort that brought 90 discrete plans competing or conflicting together into a comprehensive vision that provides, for instance, the platform for the Pullman community to have a fighting chance to be able to get a national park designation there, which will be an important step forward in stabilizing and strengthening that community for that. There's the efforts in the Inglewood area around urban agriculture and the planning efforts there around green, healthy communities and the planning that is going for the food system, that it's communities working together. And that's the resounding message that we heard from the on-the-table conversation, people want to come together and work together for that. If we're looking at the secret sauce for any of these, for combating violence, for improving neighborhood schools, it's open the doors for people to work together.
Let me ask you what your thoughts are on this. And Bernita and I had this conversation before we came out here today, and I was saying that there are some things that work in different areas that have worked over the years, and it doesn't seem to be, I mean, this is not rocket science. It's like if there's some things that work, it would seem that the system could take from some of those places if Jeffrey Canada's children's zone works in New York, and you know, there's some people here in Chicago who have had individual things that work, and kids come out of that, come up, graduate, do well. There's got to be some unifying factor that you can tie into. I mean, the Marva Collins prep worked. Okay, some things that happened there, and I recognize, you know, the whole thing with the teachers union and restrictions are part of that in terms of what people can do. But you can't convince me that there are not some elements of each of those things that could be put together, and everything doesn't work for every situation, but these are people who have been successful in educating our children. And so, obviously, when you look at the numbers, Isaiah going back to numbers, but this does make sense. You and I talked about this. If you go back to numbers and you see how much it costs to incarcerate people, how much it costs in health services for people who get injured in violent acts and all of that, compared with what it costs to incorporate some of those ideas into a working system of some kind, it just, to me, is not, this is not rocket science, that you can, you know, just from an expenditure standpoint, it costs less to do this than to do this, to put people in jail at $60,000 to $80,000 or $40,000 to $60,000 a year per inmate.
The best practices are debated heavily, and this room is filled with people who really understand or debate probably very actively best practices or what they perceive to be best practices. Trying to create ways for those best practices to be incorporated, to make them a part of your working system around education and community development is an ongoing struggle. It's a debate, it's a healthy debate, but making those things actionable in your community is one of the things that I think people in this room strive to do, and one of the reasons we're here, is we're debating and we're arguing and hopefully agreeing around some of those, and cost-benefit analysis is also being applied. You know, this is a best practice. What are the outcomes? What does it cost? You know, do we get the benefit in our community from these best practices? So that dialogue is underway, but I think, again, the communicating that out, getting action and engagement by parents, and collaborations within communities to you know, really ignite those practices and embed them in their communities is one of the ongoing challenges. And they are a part of building, over the long view, the kinds of outcomes you hope for. Embed those practices in your community, have fewer folks going into the jail and the prisons. But you've got to have the long view.
Terry Mazzini, in terms of what the community fund does when you look at different situations and how you make a determination about what you're going to support and what level of commitment you're going to have, just kind of give us an overview of how that works.
Yeah, we start with the data, the heat maps. Suzanne had put up one of those heat maps, and they all get fairly repetitive if you look at unemployment, if you look at obesity, if you look at food deserts and all that. So it arrives at an understanding of disparity, economic opportunity, education opportunity. We look at the social safety net. The trust is the largest funder of the human services that have been hard pressed by cuts at the state level that have put a excessive burden, and as Robin Staines talked about, requiring our human service organizations to basically float the state because of past due contract payments to our neighborhood human service agencies for that. Arts and culture is very important. You and Isaiah have talked about that. Young people need something to be passionate about in school. It may be just one thing. You may hate science and math and reading, but you show up because you're part of a basketball team or because you're part of the band, and in showing up, you get access to everything else. Our commitment with the arts is out into the neighborhoods, and an amazing program called Arts Infusion, bringing it into the Juvenile Detention Center for young kids who are very talented, but something went wrong at some point. They ended up there, but they've got extraordinary talent, and it goes back to the humanity for bringing in hip-hop artists, dance, performance, musicians, engaging the young people. All of a sudden, the guards at the detention center start to think about the young people differently. Wow, they're not just a number or an inmate and a gang member. They actually somebody who has talent, who sees joy in the world, who can express love, as Isaiah would say. And so we go across all of these areas and look to say, but for funding from the trust, where would this not happen? And so that is the ultimate determination for where we come in. Chicagoland is fortunate because we have a lot of wealth here, and we have a lot of generous donors and corporations that many communities don't have. We have people like Isaiah who comes back and reinvests in the community where he got his start. For our 100th anniversary coming up next year, our audacious aspiration for the region is to become the most philanthropic region in the community. As government resources are increasingly diminished, we can't look for government to provide the solutions. We have to look more to ourselves, and we think that there is a wonderful capacity and ethic of giving back in Chicago that we can amplify and support, that more people are giving their time, talent, and treasure to making good things happen.
We've got about 5 minutes left, and so I'd like to go to each of you and what you'd like to see happen, Bernita, about education, because the schools are something that's a major concern. And I know, as you pointed out to me, your organization covers a lot of areas in terms of life in communities and other things that are important. But given what you talked about today and the stats that you presented and all the problems that exist, what would you like to see? What do you think is a way to approach a solution to the problem?
Well, since this is my last chance to say something, I am going to say that despite everything we've talked about, the glass is half full, at least I like to look at it. So in terms of my community, we are making progress in creating a healthy and vibrant place for people of all levels of income to live. So there is a sense of a rebirth or revitalization. But we are still struggling with the quality of our schools. And so what I would like to do, and I think we talked about this earlier, is I think we have to stop looking back at what happened and stop talking about it. Keep it in memory that yes, 50 schools were closed. Keep it in your memory, but move forward and let's talk about how we are going to improve the quality of the schools that are remaining so that we prevent more closings. So that our children are better equipped and better educated. And what supports are they going to need? They're clearly going to need some support. You and I talked about the fact that we've got 9th graders coming in reading at a 5th grade level, right? There really isn't anything that 9th grade teacher has in his or her toolbox to handle that. So what can be done to help support those kinds of situations and bring resources so that we bring our kids up to where they need to be?
Urban?
You know, I first just want to again really just thank Isaiah and to thank Terry for all their work and all the things they've done to reach out and to communicate their stories, and Terry's efforts to create more inclusive opportunities for conversation, for engagement. You know, I'm struck, you mentioned about the Jackie Robinson Little League and the notion that it was parent-driven, led to the success of that team and the good spirit it created for this region. But, you know, for a number of parents, particularly those in the suburbs, and I know myself, I'm a city guy, but I've done a lot of coaching, a lot of volunteering in the community around sports. And, you know, we realized that that's not an unusual situation. You know, you probably had a lot of suburban parents going, yeah, so what? Yeah, the parents are involved. But they don't realize the challenges, and they don't realize, you know, but for those parents being involved, most of those kids would be in a very different situation. And so that drives me back to not only parent engagement with their children, but parents, citizens in their communities being very, very wedded to plans, conversations, strategies, initiatives that are targeted for their communities. Get involved. Everyone has a contribution. Everyone can move that ball. And without that, the decision-making, the over-design, the barriers, all of those things become greater challenges. So I'm hoping this conversation and things like this help change that.
Isaiah?
I would start by thanking everyone for being honest and giving of your time today, and all of you for coming out. I think the treating of the mind and the body in this country needs to be connected. And when I talk about arts, sports, recreation, and play, how does that help the individual in poverty? It gives you a natural high. So you self-medicate. And when you self-medicate in poverty because you are allowed to play, because you're allowed to sing, because you're allowed to experience, we have the art festival that's in town right now, your mind, and it's been well documented how your body reacts to those things. And in poverty, and when we're talking about the lower class in our society, compassion, care, understanding needs to be accounted for. These are not just cold, hard numbers, because when you look at a cold, hard number, you say, well, the bottom 5%, or shit, we just can't help, you know, they're out. Well, I was that bottom 5%. And I am telling you, if you give care, you give love, and you provide opportunity, he or she can and will make it.
And by the way, just as we close, I'll tell you this one quick story. There's a friend of mine, a musician, by the name of Jimmy Tillman. He's a drummer. He used to be the musical director for the Black Ensemble Theater. And a few years ago, he also teaches in the Chicago Public School System. But a few years ago, he used to take a group to the Audi home, and he would engage these kids in little theatrical presentations. And he said it was amazing. Some of these kids never knew they had that kind of talent to be able to act. And he said just to watch them transition from, you know, real tough guy, and then find out that this kid found out for himself that he had the ability to do that, they amazed themselves. So the arts and culture thing, incredibly important. I just wanted to share that with you. I think our time is up. Neighborhood as an urban strategy. We want to thank Isaiah Thomas, CEO and founder of Isaiah International, LLC, and former NBA star of Detroit Pistons.
Yay, Detroit!
When we beat in the finals, finally, they did beat us a lot of times before we got to do that. Bernita Johnson Gabriel, Executive Director, Quad Communities Development, thank you so much for being with us today. Herman Brewer, Bureau Chief, Economic Development for Cook County, thanks a lot for being with us today. And Terry Mazzani, it's just always a pleasure to see you and have you with us, President and CEO of the Chicago Community Trust. I want to thank you all so much for doing this today. How about a hand for them? Thank you. Oh, one more thing. Now, this concludes the morning plenary. We're inviting you to room C to enjoy lunch, and we will begin our afternoon breakout sessions at 1 p.m. Thank you very much.